Barsoom Series, Book 3, Part 2, by Edgar Rice Burroughs, The Warlord of Mars. Chapter 9, With the Yellow Men. Dejah was not long in joining me, and though we found the hooked weapon a strange and savage thing with which to deal, the three of us soon dispatched the 5 black-bearded warriors who opposed us. When the battle was over, our new acquaintance turned to me, and removing the shield from his wrist, held it out. I did not know the significance of his act, but judged that it was but a form of expressing his gratitude to me. I afterward learned that it symbolized the offering of a man's life in return for some great favor done him, and my act of refusing, which I had immediately done, was what was expected of me. "Then accept from Talu, Prince of Marantina," said the yellow man, "this token of my gratitude," and reaching beneath one of his wide sleeves, he withdrew a bracelet and placed it upon my arm. He then went through the same ceremony with Dejah. Next, he asked our names, and from what land we hailed. He seemed quite familiar with the geography of the outer world, and when I said I was from Helium, he raised his brows. "Ah," he said, "you seek your ruler and his company. Know you of them?" I asked. But little more than that they were captured by my uncle, Relentless Al, Jeddak of Jeddaks, ruler of Arkar, land of the yellow men of Barsoom. As to their fate I know nothing, for I am at war with my uncle, who would crush my power in the principality of Marantina. These from whom you have just saved me are warriors he has sent out to find and slay me, for they know that often I come alone to hunt and kill the sacred apt, which Relentless Al so much reveres. It is partly because I hate his religion that Relentless Al hates me, but mostly does he fear my growing power and the great faction which has arisen throughout Arkar, that will be glad to see me ruler of Arkar and Jeddak of Jeddaks in his place. Is a cruel and tyrannous master whom all hate, and were it not for the great fear they have of him, I could raise an army overnight that would wipe out the few that might remain loyal to him. My own people are faithful to me, and the little valley of Marantina has paid no tribute to the court of Relentless Al for a year. Nor can he force us, for a dozen men may hold the narrow way to Marantina against 1,000,000. But now, as to thine own affairs, how may I aid you? My palace is at your disposal, if you wish to honor me by coming to Marantina. When our work is done, we shall be glad to accept your invitation, I replied. But now, you can assist us most by directing us to the court of Relentless Al and suggesting some means by which we may gain admission to the city and the palace, or whatever other place we find our friends to be confined. Talu gazed ruefully at our smooth faces, and at Dejah's red skin and my white one. "First you must come to Marantina," he said, "for great change must be wrought in your appearance before you can hope to enter any city in Arkar. You must have yellow faces and black beards, and your apparel and trappings must be those least likely to arouse suspicion. In my palace is one who can make you appear as truly yellow men as does Relentless Al himself." His counsel seemed wise, and as there was apparently no other way to ensure a successful entry to Cadabra, the capital city of Arkar, we set out with Talu, Prince of Marantina, for his little rock-bound country. The way was over some of the worst traveling I have ever seen, and I do not wonder that in this land, where there are neither thoats nor flyers, that Marantina is in little fear of invasion. But at last we reached our destination, the first view of which I had from a slight elevation a half-mile from the city. Nestled in a deep valley lay a city of Martian concrete, whose every street and plaza and open space was roofed with glass. All about lay snow and ice, but there was none upon the rounded, dome-like, crystal covering that enveloped the whole city. Then I saw how these people combated the rigors of the Arctic and lived in luxury and comfort in the midst of a land of perpetual ice. Their cities were veritable hothouses, and when I had come within this one, my respect and admiration for the scientific and engineering skill of this buried nation was unbounded. The moment we entered the city, Talu threw off his outer garments of fur, as did we, and I saw that his apparel differed but little from that of the red races of Barsoom. Except for his leathern harness, covered thick with jewels and metal, he was naked, nor could one have comfortably worn apparel in that warm and humid atmosphere. For 3 days we remained the guests of Prince Talu, and during that time he showered upon us every attention and courtesy within his power. He showed us all that was of interest in his great city. The Marantina atmosphere plant will maintain life indefinitely in the cities of the North Pole after all life, upon the balance of dying Mars, is extinct through the failure of the air supply. Should the great central plant again cease functioning, as it did upon that memorable occasion that gave me the opportunity of restoring life and happiness to the strange world that I had already learned to love so well. He showed us the heating system that stores the sun's rays in great reservoirs beneath the city, and how little is necessary to maintain the perpetual summer heat of the glorious garden spot within this Arctic paradise. Broad avenues of sod sown with the seed of the arsha vegetation of the Dead Sea bottoms carried the noiseless traffic of light and airy ground flyers that are the only form of artificial transportation used north of the gigantic ice barrier. The broad tires of these unique flyers are but rubber-like gas bags filled with the eighth Barsoomian ray, or ray of propulsion, that remarkable discovery of the Martians that has made possible the great fleets of mighty airships that render the red man of the outer world supreme. It is this ray which propels the inherent or reflected light of the planet off into space, and when confined gives to the Martian craft their airy buoyancy. The ground flyers of Marantina contain just sufficient buoyancy in their automobile-like wheels to give the cars traction for steering purposes, and though the hind wheels are geared to the engine and aid in driving the machine, the bulk of this work is carried by a small propeller at the stern. I know of no more delightful sensation than that of riding in one of these luxuriously appointed cars, which skim, light and airy as feathers, along the soft, mossy avenues of Marantina. They move with absolute noiselessness between borders of crimson sward and beneath arching trees gorgeous with the wondrous blooms that mark so many of the highly cultivated varieties of Barsoomian vegetation. By the end of the third day, the court barber, I can think of no other earthly appellation by which to describe him, had wrought so remarkable a transformation in both Thuvan Dihin and myself that our own wives would never have known us. Our skins were of the same lemon color as his own, and great, black beards and mustaches had been deftly affixed to our smooth faces. The trappings of warriors of Arkar aided in the deception, and for where beyond the Heart-House cities, we each had suits of the black and yellow-striped Orluk. Talu gave us careful directions for the journey to Cadabra, the capital city of the Arkar nation, which is the racial name of the Yellow Men. This good friend even accompanied us part way, and then, promising to aid us in any way that he found possible, bade us adieu. On parting, he slipped upon my finger a curiously wrought ring set with a dead black, lustreless stone, which appeared more like a bit of bituminous coal than the priceless Barsoomian gem which in reality it is. There had been but 3 others cut from the mother stone, he said, which is in my possession. These 3 are worn by nobles high in my confidence, all of whom have been sent on secret missions to the court of Salensus Arl. Should you come within 50 feet of any of these 3, you will feel a rapid, pricking sensation in the finger upon which you wear this ring. He who wears one of its mates will experience the same feeling. It is caused by an electrical action that takes place the moment 2 of these gems, cut from the same mother stone, come within the radius of each other's power. By it, you will know that a friend is at hand upon whom you may depend for assistance in time of need. Should another wearer of one of these gems call upon you for aid, do not deny him. Should death threaten, you swallow the ring rather than let it fall into the hands of enemies. Guard it with your life, John Carter, for some day it may mean more than life to you. With this parting admonition, our good friend turned back toward Marantina, and we set our faces in the direction of the city of Cadabra and the court of Salensus Arl, Jeddak of Jeddaks. That very evening we came within sight of the walled and glass-roofed city of Cadabra. It lies in a low depression near the pole, surrounded by rocky, snow-clad hills. From the pass through which we entered the valley, we had a splendid view of this great city of the north. Its crystal domes sparkled in the brilliant sunlight, gleaming above the frost-covered outer wall that circles the entire 100 miles of its circumference. At regular intervals, great gates give entrance to the city, but even at the distance from which we looked upon the massive pile, we could see that all were closed, and in accordance with Talu's suggestion, we deferred attempting to enter the city until the following morning. As he had said, we found numerous caves in the hillsides about us, and into one of these we crept for the night. Our warm Orluk skins kept us perfectly comfortable, and it was only after a most refreshing sleep that we awoke shortly after daylight on the following morning. Already the city was astir, and from several of the gates we saw parties of yellow men emerging. Following closely each detail of the instructions given us by our good friend of Marantina, we remained concealed for several hours, until one party of some half-dozen warriors had passed along the trail below our hiding place and entered the hills by way of the pass along which we had come the previous evening. After giving them time to get well out of sight of our cave, Dejah and I crept out and followed them, overtaking them when they were well into the hills. When we had come almost to them, I called aloud to their leader, when the whole party halted and turned toward us. The crucial test had come. Could we but deceive these men, the rest would be comparatively easy. "Kaor," I cried as I came closer to them. "Kaor," responded the officer in charge of the party. "We be from Elol," I continued, giving the name of the most remote city of Arkar, which has little or no intercourse with Cadabra. Only yesterday we arrived, and this morning the captain of the gate told us that you were setting out to hunt orluks, which is a sport we do not find in our own neighborhood. We have hastened after you to pray that you allow us to accompany you." The officer was entirely deceived and graciously permitted us to go with them for the day. The chance guess that they were bound upon an orluk hunt proved correct, and Talu had said that the chances were 10 to 1 that such would be the mission of any party leaving Cadabra by the pass through which we entered the valley, since that way leads directly to the vast plains frequented by this elephantine beast of prey. In so far as the hunt was concerned, the day was a failure, for we did not see a single orluk. But this proved more than fortunate for us, since the yellow men were so chagrined by their misfortune that they would not enter the city by the same gate by which they had left it in the morning, as it seemed that they had made great boasts to the captain of that gate about their skill at this dangerous sport. We, therefore, approached Cadabra at a point several miles from that at which the party had quitted it in the morning, and so were relieved of the danger of embarrassing questions and explanations on the part of the gate captain, whom we had said had directed us to this particular hunting party. We had come quite close to the city when my attention was attracted toward a tall black shaft that reared its head several hundred feet into the air from what appeared to be a tangled mass of junk or wreckage, now partially snow-covered. I did not dare venture an inquiry for fear of arousing suspicion by evident ignorance of something which as a yellow man I should have known. But before we reached the city gate, I was to learn the purpose of that grim shaft and the meaning of the mighty accumulation beneath it. We had come almost to the gate when one of the party called to his fellows, at the same time pointing toward the distant southern horizon. Following the direction he indicated, my eyes descried the hull of a large flyer approaching rapidly from above the crest of the encircling hills. "Still other fools who would solve the mysteries of the forbidden north," said the officer, half to himself. "Will they never cease their fatal curiosity?" "Let us hope not," answered one of the warriors, "for then what should we do for slaves and sport?" "True, but what stupid beasts they are to continue to come to a region from whence none of them ever has returned." "Let us tarry and watch the end of this one," suggested one of the men. The officer looked toward the city. "The watch has seen him," he said. "We may remain, for we may be needed." I looked toward the city and saw several hundred warriors issuing from the nearest gate. They moved leisurely, as though there were no need for haste, nor was there, as I was presently to learn. Then I turned my eyes once more toward the flyer. She was moving rapidly toward the city, and when she had come close enough, I was surprised to see that her propellers were idle. Straight for that grim shaft she bore. At the last minute, I saw the great blades move to reverse her, yet on she came as though drawn by some mighty, irresistible power. Intense excitement prevailed upon her deck, where men were running hither and thither, manning the guns, and preparing to launch the small, one-man flyers, a fleet of which is part of the equipment of every Martian war vessel. Closer and closer to the black shaft, the ship sped. In another instant she must strike, and then I saw the familiar signal flown that sends the lesser boats in a great flock from the deck of the mothership. Instantly, 100 tiny flyers rose from her deck, like a swarm of huge dragonflies, but scarcely were they clear of the battleship than the nose of each turned toward the shaft, and they, too, rushed on at frightful speed toward the same now seemingly inevitable end that menaced the larger vessel. A moment later the collision came. Men were hurled in every direction from the ship's deck, while she, bent and crumpled, took the last, long plunge to the scrap heap at the shaft's base. With her fell a shower of her own tiny flyers, for each of them had come in violent collision with the solid shaft. I noticed that the wrecked flyers scraped down the shaft's side, and that their fall was not as rapid as might have been expected. And then suddenly the secret of the shaft burst upon me, and with it an explanation of the cause that prevented a flyer that passed too far across the ice barrier ever returning. The shaft was a mighty magnet, and when once a vessel came within the radius of its powerful attraction for the aluminum steel that enters so largely into the construction of all Barsoomian craft, no power on earth could prevent such an end as we had just witnessed. I afterward learned that the shaft rests directly over the magnetic pole of Mars, but whether this adds in any way to its incalculable power of attraction I do not know. I am a fighting man, not a scientist. Here, at last, was an explanation of the long absence of Tardo's Moors and Moor's Kajak. These valiant and intrepid warriors had dared the mysteries and dangers of the frozen north to search for Thoris, whose long absence had bowed in grief the head of his beautiful mother, Dejah Thoris, Princess of Helium. The moment that the last of the flyers came to rest at the base of the shaft, the black-bearded, yellow warriors swarmed over the mass of wreckage upon which they lay, making prisoners of those who were uninjured and occasionally dispatching, with a sword thrust, one of the wounded, who seemed prone to resent their taunts and insults. A few of the uninjured red men battled bravely against their cruel foes, but for the most part they seemed too overwhelmed by the horror of the catastrophe that had befallen them to do more than submit supinely to the golden chains with which they were manacled. When the last of the prisoners had been confined, the party returned to the city, at the gate of which we met a pack of fierce, gold-collared apes, each of which marched between two warriors, who held them with strong chains of the same metal as their collars. Just beyond the gate, the attendants loosened the whole terrible herd, and as they bounded off toward the grim, black shaft, I did not need to ask to know their mission. Had there not been those within the cruel city of Cadabra who needed succor far worse than the poor unfortunate dead, and dying out there in the cold upon the bent and broken carcasses of 1,000 flyers, I could not have restrained my desire to hasten back and do battle with those horrid creatures that had been dispatched to rend and devour them. As it was, I could but follow the yellow warriors with bowed head and give thanks for the chance that had given Thuvan Dihin and me such easy ingress to the capital of Salensus all. Once within the gates, we had no difficulty in eluding our friends of the morning, and presently found ourselves in a Martian hostelry. Chapter 10. Endurance. The public houses of Barsoom, I have found, vary but little. There is no privacy for other than married couples. Men without their wives are escorted to a large chamber, the floor of which is usually of white marble or heavy glass, kept scrupulously clean. Here are many small raised platforms for the guests sleeping silks and furs, and if he have none of his own, clean, fresh ones are furnished at a nominal charge. Once a man's belongings have been deposited upon one of these platforms, he is a guest of the house, and that platform his own until he leaves. No one will disturb or molest his belongings, as there are no thieves upon Mars. As assassination is the one thing to be feared, the proprietors of the hostelries furnish armed guards, who pace back and forth through the sleeping rooms day and night. The number of guards and gorgeousness of their trappings quite usually denote the status of the hotel. No meals are served in these houses, but generally a public eating place adjoins them. Baths are connected with the sleeping chambers, and each guest is required to bathe daily or depart from the hotel. Usually on a second or third floor, there is a large sleeping room for single women guests, but its appointments do not vary materially from the chamber occupied by men. The guards who watch the women remain in the corridor outside the sleeping chamber, while female slaves pace back and forth among the sleepers within, ready to notify the warriors should their presence be required. I was surprised to note that all the guards with the hotel at which we stopped were red men, and on inquiring of one of them, I learned that they were slaves purchased by the proprietors of the hotels from the government. The man whose post was past my sleeping platform had been commander of the navy of a great Martian nation, but fate had carried his flagship across the ice barrier within the radius of power of the magnetic shaft, and now for many tedious years he had been a slave of the yellow men. He told me that princes, Jeds, and even Jedaks of the outer world were among the menials who served the yellow race. But when I asked him if he had heard of the fate of Moors Kajak or Tardos Moors, he shook his head, saying that he never had heard of their being prisoners here, though he was very familiar with the reputations and fame they bore in the outer world. Neither had he heard any rumor of the coming of the father of Therns and the black data of the firstborn, but he hastened to explain that he knew little of what took place within the palace. I could see that he wondered not a little that a yellow man should be so inquisitive about certain red prisoners from beyond the ice barrier, and that I should be so ignorant of customs and conditions among my own race. In fact, I had forgotten my disguise upon discovering a red man pacing before my sleeping platform. But his growing expression of surprise warned me in time, for I had no mind to reveal my identity to any unless some good could come of it, and I did not see how this poor fellow could serve me yet, though I had it in my mind that later I might be the means of serving him and all the other thousands of prisoners who do the bidding of their stern masters in Cadabra. Thuvan Dihin and I discussed our plans as we sat together among our sleeping silks and furs that night in the midst of the hundreds of yellow men who occupied the apartment with us. We spoke in low whispers, but as that is only what courtesy demands in a public sleeping place, we roused no suspicion. Last, determining that all must be but idle speculation, until after we had had a chance to explore the city and attempt to put into execution the plan Tarlu had suggested, we bade each other good night and turned to sleep. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. After breakfasting the following morning, we set out to see Cadabra, and as, through the generosity of the Prince of Marentina, we were well supplied with the funds current in Arkar, we purchased a handsome ground flyer. Having learned to drive them while in Marentina, we spent a delightful and profitable day exploring the city, and late in the afternoon at the hour Tarlu told us we would find government officials in their offices. We stopped before a magnificent building on the plaza opposite the royal grounds and the palace. Here we walked boldly in past the armed guard at the door, to be met by a red slave within who asked our wishes. "Tell Sorav, your master, that 2 warriors from Elul wish to take service in the palace guard," I said. Sorav, Tarlu had told us, was the commander of the forces of the palace, and as men from the further cities of Arkar, and especially Elul, were less likely to be tainted with the germ of intrigue which had for years infected the household of Salensus Arl. He was sure that we would be welcomed, and few questions asked us. He had primed us with such general information as he thought would be necessary for us to pass muster before Sorav, after which we would have to undergo a further examination before Salensus Arl that he might determine our physical fitness and our ability as warriors. The little experience we had had with the strange hooked sword of the yellow man and his cup-like shield made it seem rather unlikely that either of us could pass this final test. But there was the chance that we might be quartered in the palace of Salensus Arl for several days after being accepted by Sorav, before the Jedak of Jedaks would find time to put us to the final test. After a wait of several minutes in an antechamber, we were summoned into the private office of Sorav, where we were courteously greeted by this ferocious-appearing, black-bearded officer. He asked us our names and stations in our own city, and having received replies that were evidently satisfactory to him, he put certain questions to us that Tarlu had foreseen and prepared us for. The interview could not have lasted over 10 minutes when Sorav summoned an aide whom he instructed to record us properly, and then escort us to the quarters in the palace, which are set aside for aspirants to membership in the palace guard. The aide took us to his own office first, where he measured and weighed and photographed us simultaneously with a machine ingeniously devised for that purpose, 5 copies being instantly reproduced in 5 different offices of the government, 2 of which are located in other cities, miles distant. Then he led us through the palace grounds to the main guardroom of the palace, there turning us over to the officer in charge. This individual again questioned us briefly and finally dispatched a soldier to guide us to our quarters. These we found located upon the 2nd floor of the palace in a semi-detached tower at the rear of the edifice. When we asked our guide why we were quartered so far from the guardroom, he replied that the custom of the older members of the guard of picking quarrels with aspirants to try their mettle had resulted in so many deaths that it was found difficult to maintain the guard at its full strength while this custom prevailed. Salensus Arl had, therefore, set apart these quarters for aspirants, and here they were securely locked against the danger of attack by members of the guard. This unwelcome information put a sudden check to all our well-laid plans, for it meant that we should virtually be prisoners in the palace of Silences all until the time that he should see fit to give us the final examination for efficiency. As it was this interval upon which we had banked to accomplish so much in our search for Dejah Thoris and Thuvia of Tarth, our chagrin was unbounded when we heard the great lock click behind our guide as he had quitted us after ushering us into the chambers we were to occupy. With a wry face, I turned to Thuvin Din, my companion, but shook his head disconsolately and walked to one of the windows upon the far side of the apartment. Scarcely had he gazed beyond them than he called to me in a tone of suppressed excitement and surprise. In an instant, I was by his side. "Look," said Thuvin Din, pointing toward the courtyard below. As my eyes followed the direction indicated, I saw two women pacing back and forth in an enclosed garden. At the same moment, I recognized them. They were Dejah Thoris and Thuvia of Tarth. They were they whom I had trailed from one pole to another, the length of a world. Only 10 feet of space and a few metal bars separated me from them. With a cry, I attracted their attention, and as Dejah Thoris looked up full into my eyes, I made the sign of love that the men of Barsoom make to their women. To my astonishment and horror, her head went high, and as a look of utter contempt touched her finely chiseled features, she turned her back full upon me. My body is covered with the scars of 1,000 conflicts, but never in all my long life have I suffered such anguish from a wound. For this time the steel of a woman's look had entered my heart. With a groan, I turned away and buried my face in my arms. I heard Thuvin Din call aloud to Thuvia, but an instant later his exclamation of surprise betokened that he, too, had been repulsed by his own daughter. "They will not even listen," he cried to me. "They have put their hands over their ears and walked to the farther end of the garden. Ever heard you of such mad work, John Carter? The two must be bewitched." Presently I mustered the courage to return to the window, for even though she spurned me, I loved her, and could not keep my eyes from feasting upon her divine face and figure. But when she saw me looking, she again turned away. I was at my wits' end to account for her strange actions, and that Thuvia, too, had turned against her father seemed incredible. Could it be that my incomparable princess still clung to the hideous faith from which I had rescued her world? Could it be that she looked upon me with loathing and contempt because I had returned from the valley door, or because I had desecrated the temples and persons of the holy Therns? To naught else could I ascribe her strange deportment, yet it seemed far from possible that such could be the case, for the love of Dejah Thoris for John Carter had been a great and wondrous love, far above racial distinctions, creed, or religion. As I gazed ruefully at the back of her hoardie, royal head, a gate at the opposite end of the garden opened, and a man entered. As he did so, he turned and slipped something into the hand of the yellow guardsman beyond the gate, nor was the distance too great that I might not see that money had passed between them. Instantly, I knew that this newcomer had bribed his way within the garden. Then he turned in the direction of the two women, and I saw that he was none other than Thurid, the black data of the firstborn. He approached quite close to them before he spoke, and as they turned at the sound of his voice, I saw Dejah Thoris shrink from him. There was a nasty leer upon his face as he stepped close to her and spoke again. I could not hear his words, but her answer came clearly. "The granddaughter of Tardo's Moors can always die," she said, "but she could never live at the price you name." Then I saw the black scoundrel go upon his knees beside her, fairly groveling in the dirt, pleading with her. Only part of what he said came to me, for though he was evidently laboring under the stress of passion and excitement, it was equally apparent that he did not dare raise his voice for fear of detection. "I would save you from Mad-Eye Shang," I heard him say. "You know the fate that awaits you at his hands. Would you not choose me rather than the other?" "I would choose neither," replied Dejah Thoris, "even were I free to choose, as you know well I am not." "You are free," he cried. "John Carter, Prince of Helium, is dead. I know better than that, but even were he dead, and I must needs choose another mate, it should be a plant man or a great white ape in preference to either Mad-Eye Shang or you, Black Callot," she answered with a sneer of contempt. Of a sudden, the vicious beast lost all control of himself, as with a vile oath he leaped at the slender woman, gripping her tender throat in his brute clutch. Thuvia screamed and sprang to aid her fellow prisoner, and at the same instant I, too, went mad, and tearing at the bars that spanned my window, I ripped them from their sockets, as they had been but copper wire. Hurling myself through the aperture, I reached the garden, but 100 feet from where the black was choking the life from my Dejah Thoris, and with a single great bound I was upon him. I spoke no word as I tore his defiling fingers from that beautiful throat, nor did I utter a sound as I hurled him 20 feet from me. Foaming with rage, Thurid regained his feet and charged me like a mad bull. "Yellow man," he shrieked, "you knew not upon whom you had laid your vile hands. But ere I am done with you, you will know well what it means to offend the person of a firstborn." Then he was upon me, reaching for my throat, and precisely as I had done that day in the courtyard of the Temple of Issus, I did here in the garden of the palace of Salensus Al. I ducked beneath his outstretched arms, and as he lunged past me, I planted a terrific right upon the side of his jaw. Just as he had done upon that other occasion, he did now. Like a top he spun round, his knees gave beneath him, and he crumpled to the ground at my feet. Then I heard a voice behind me. It was the deep voice of authority that marks the ruler of men, and when I turned to face the resplendent figure of a giant yellow man, I did not need to ask to know that it was Salensus Al. At his right stood Mad-Eye Shang, and behind them a score of guardsmen. "Who are you?" he cried, "and what means this intrusion within the precincts of the women's garden? I do not recall your face. How came you here?" But for his last words, I should have forgotten my disguise entirely and told him outright that I was John Carter, Prince of Helium. But his question recalled me to myself. I pointed to the dislodged bars of the window above. "I am an aspirant to membership in the palace guard," I said, "and from yonder window in the tower, where I was confined, awaiting the final test for fitness, I saw this brute attack this woman. I could not stand idly by, O Jeddak, and see this thing done within the very palace grounds, and yet feel that I was fit to serve and guard your royal person." I had evidently made an impression upon the ruler of Arkar by my fair words, and when he had turned to Dejah Thoris and Thuvia of Tarth, and both had corroborated my statements, it began to look pretty dark for Thurid. I saw the ugly gleam in Mad-Eye Shang's evil eyes as Dejah Thoris narrated all that had passed between Thurid and herself, and when she came to that part which dealt with my interference with the data of the firstborn, her gratitude was quite apparent, though I could see by her eyes that something puzzled her strangely. I did not wonder at her attitude toward me while others were present, but that she should have denied me, while she and Thuvia were the only occupants of the garden, still cut me sorely. As the examination proceeded, I cast a glance at Thurid and startled him looking wide-eyed and wonderingly at me, and then of a sudden he laughed full in my face. A moment later Salensus Al turned toward the black. "What have you to say in explanation of these charges?" he asked in a deep and terrible voice. "Dare you aspire to one whom the father of Therns has chosen, one who might even be a fit mate for the Jeddak of Jeddaks himself?" And then the black-bearded tyrant turned and cast a sudden greedy look upon Dejah Thoris, as though with the words a new thought and a new desire had sprung up within his mind and breast. Thurid had been about to reply, and with a malicious grin upon his face, was pointing an accusing finger at me, when Salensus Al's words and the expression of his face cut him short. A cunning look crept into his eyes, and I knew from the expression of his face that his next words were not the ones he had intended to speak. "O mightiest of Jeddaks," he said, "the man and the women do not speak the truth. The fellow had come into the garden to assist them to escape. I was beyond and overheard their conversation, and when I entered, the woman screamed and the man sprang upon me and would have killed me. What know you of this man? He is a stranger to you, and I dare say that you will find him an enemy and a spy. Let him be put on trial, Salensus Al, rather than your friend and guest, Thurid, data of the firstborn." Salensus Al looked puzzled. He turned again and looked upon Dejah Thoris, and then Thurid stepped quite close to him and whispered something in his ear, what I know not. Presently the yellow ruler turned to one of his officers. "See that this man be securely confined until we have time to go deeper into this affair," he commanded, "and as bars alone seem inadequate to restrain him, let chains be added." Then he turned and left the garden, taking Dejah Thoris with him, his hand upon her shoulder. Thurid and Mad-Eye Shang went also, and as they reached the gateway, the black turned and laughed again aloud in my face. What could be the meaning of his sudden change toward me? Could he suspect my true identity? It must be that, and the thing that had betrayed me was the trick and blow that had laid him low for the second time. As the guards dragged me away, my heart was very sad and bitter indeed, for now to the two relentless enemies that had hounded her for so long another, and a more powerful one, had been added. For I would have been but a fool had I not recognized the sudden love for Dejah Thoris that had just been born in the terrible breast of Silenceus Arl, Jeddak of Jeddaks, ruler of Arkar. Chapter 11. The Pit of Plenty. I did not languish long within the prison of Silenceus Arl. During the short time that I lay there, fettered with chains of gold, I often wondered as to the fate of Thuvan Dihin, Jeddak of Tarth. My brave companion had followed me into the garden as I attacked Thurid, and when Silenceus Arl had left with Dejah Thoris and the others, leaving Thuvir of Tarth behind, he too had remained in the garden with his daughter, apparently unnoticed, for he was apparelled similarly to the guards. The last I had seen of him, he stood waiting for the warriors who escorted me to close the gate behind them, that he might be alone with Thuvir. Could it be possible that they had escaped? I doubted it, and yet with all my heart I hoped that it might be true. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The third day of my incarceration brought a dozen warriors to escort me to the audience chamber, where Silenceus Arl himself was to try me. A great number of nobles crowded the room, and among them I saw Thurid, but Mad-Eye Shang was not there. Dejah Thoris, as radiantly beautiful as ever, sat upon a small throne beside Silenceus Arl. The expression of sad hopelessness upon her dear face cut deep into my heart. Her position beside the Jeddak of Jeddaks boded ill for her and me, and on the instant that I saw her there sprang to my mind the firm intention never to leave that chamber alive if I must leave her in the clutches of this powerful tyrant. I had killed better men than Silenceus Arl, and killed them with my bare hands, and now I swore to myself that I should kill him if I found that the only way to save the Princess of Helium, that it would mean almost instant death for me I cared not, except that it would remove me from further efforts in behalf of Dejah Thoris, and for this reason alone I would have chosen another way, for even though I should kill Silenceus Arl, that act would not restore my beloved wife to her own people. I determined to wait the final outcome of the trial, that I might learn all that I could of the Arkarian ruler's intentions, and then act accordingly. Scarcely had I come before him than Silenceus Arl summoned Thurid also. "Dejah Thurid," he said, "you have made a strange request of me, but in accordance with your wishes and your promise that it will result only to my interests, I have decided to accede. You tell me that a certain announcement will be the means of convicting this prisoner, and at the same time open the way to the gratification of my dearest wish." Thurid nodded. "Then shall I make the announcement here before all my nobles?" continued Silenceus Arl. "For a year no queen has sat upon the throne beside me, and now it suits me to take to wife one who is reputed the most beautiful woman upon Barsoom, a statement which none may truthfully deny. Nobles of Arkar, unsheathe your swords and do homage to Dejah Thoris, Princess of Helium and future Queen of Arkar, for at the end of the allotted 10 days she shall become the wife of Silenceus Arl." As the nobles drew their blades and lifted them on high, in accordance with the ancient custom of Arkar, when a Jeddak announces his intention to wed, Dejah Thoris sprang to her feet and, raising a hand aloft, cried in a loud voice that they desist. "I may not be the wife of Silenceus Arl," she pleaded, "for already I be a wife and mother. John Carter, Prince of Helium, still lives. I know it to be true, for I overheard Mad-Eye Shang tell his daughter Fedor that he had seen him in Kaor at the court of Kulan Tithe, Jeddak. A Jeddak does not wed a married woman, nor will Silenceus Arl thus violate the bonds of matrimony." Silenceus Arl turned upon Thurid with an ugly look. "Is this the surprise you held in store for me?" he cried. "You assured me that no obstacle which might not be easily overcome stood between me and this woman, and now I find that the one insuperable obstacle intervenes. What mean you, man? What have you to say? And should I deliver John Carter into your hands, Silenceus Arl, would you not feel that I had more than satisfied the promise that I made you?" answered Thurid. "Talk not like a fool," cried the enraged Jeddak. "I am no child to be thus played with." "I am talking only as a man who knows," replied Thurid. "Knows that he can do all that he claims. Then turn John Carter over to me within 10 days, or yourself suffer the end that I should mete out to him were he in my power." snapped the Jeddak of Jeddaks, with an ugly scowl. "You need not wait 10 days, Salensus all," replied Thurid, and then, turning suddenly upon me as he extended a pointing finger, he cried, "There stands John Carter, Prince of Helium." "Fool!" shrieked Salensus all. "Fool! John Carter is a white man. This fellow be as yellow as myself. John Carter's face is smooth. Mad-Eye Shang has described him to me. This prisoner has a beard and mustache as large and black as any in Arkar. Quick, guardsmen, to the pits with the black maniac who wishes to throw his life away for a poor joke upon your ruler." "Hold!" cried Thurid, and springing forward before I could guess his intention, he had grasped my beard and ripped the whole false fabric from my face and head, revealing my smooth, tanned skin beneath and my close-cropped black hair. Instantly, pandemonium reigned in the audience chamber of Salensus all. Warriors pressed forward with drawn blades, thinking that I might be contemplating the assassination of the Jeddak of Jeddaks, while others, out of curiosity to see one whose name was familiar from pole to pole, crowded behind their fellows. As my identity was revealed, I saw Dejah Thoris spring to her feet, amazement writ large upon her face, and then through that jam of armed men she forced her way before any could prevent. A moment only and she was before me with outstretched arms and eyes filled with the light of her great love. "John Carter, John Carter," she cried as I folded her to my breast, and then of a sudden I knew why she had denied me in the garden beneath the tower. What a fool I had been, expecting that she would penetrate the marvelous disguise that had been wrought for me by the barber of Marentina. She had not known me, that was all, and when she saw the sign of love from a stranger, she was offended and righteously indignant. "Indeed, but I had been a fool, and it was you," she cried, "who spoke to me from the tower. How could I dream that my beloved Virginian lay behind that fierce beard and that yellow skin?" She had been wont to call me her Virginian as a term of endearment, for she knew that I loved the sound of that beautiful name, made 1,000 times more beautiful and hallowed by her dear lips. And as I heard it again, after all those long years, my eyes became dimmed with tears, and my voice choked with emotion. But an instant did I crush that dear form to me ere Salensus all, trembling with rage and jealousy, shouldered his way to us. "Seize the man," he cried to his warriors, and 100 ruthless hands tore us apart. Well, it was for the nobles of the court of Arkar that John Carter had been disarmed. As it was, a dozen of them felt the weight of my clenched fists, and I had fought my way half up the steps before the throne, to which Salensus all had carried Dejah Thoris ere ever they could stop me. Then I went down, fighting, beneath 100 warriors. But before they had battered me into unconsciousness, I heard that from the lips of Dejah Thoris that made all my suffering well worthwhile. Standing there beside the great tyrant who clutched her by the arm, she pointed to where I fought alone against such awful odds. "Think you, Salensus all, that the wife of such as he is," she cried, "would ever dishonor his memory, were he 1,000 times dead, by mating with a lesser mortal? Lives there upon any world such another as John Carter, Prince of Helium? Lives there another man who could fight his way back and forth across a warlike planet, facing savage beasts and hordes of savage men, for the love of a woman? I, Dejah Thoris, Princess of Helium, am his. He fought for me and won me. If you be a brave man, you will honor the bravery that is his, and you will not kill him. Make him a slave, if you will. Silence us all, but spare his life. I would rather be a slave with such as he than be queen of Arkar." "Neither slave nor queen dictates to silence us all," replied the Jeddak of Jeddaks. "John Carter shall die a natural death in the pit of plenty, and the day he dies, Dejah Thoris shall become my queen." I did not hear her reply, for it was then that a blow upon my head brought unconsciousness, and when I recovered my senses, only a handful of guardsmen remained in the audience chamber with me. As I opened my eyes, they goaded me with the points of their swords and bade me rise. Then they led me through long corridors to a court far toward the center of the palace. In the center of the court was a deep pit, near the edge of which stood 6 other guardsmen, awaiting me. One of them carried a long rope in his hands, which he commenced to make ready as we approached. We had come to within 50 feet of these men, when I felt a sudden, strange, and rapid pricking sensation in one of my fingers. For a moment I was nonplussed by the odd feeling, and then there came to me recollection of that which in the stress of my adventure I had entirely forgotten, the gift ring of Prince Tarlu of Marentina. Instantly, I looked toward the group we were nearing, at the same time raising my left hand to my forehead, that the ring might be visible to one who sought it. Simultaneously, one of the waiting warriors raised his left hand, ostensibly to brush back his hair, and upon one of his fingers I saw the duplicate of my own ring. A quick look of intelligence passed between us, after which I kept my eyes turned away from the warrior and did not look at him again, for fear that I might arouse the suspicion of the Arcarians. When we reached the edge of the pit, I saw that it was very deep, and presently I realized I was soon to judge just how far it extended below the surface of the court, for he who held the rope passed it about my body in such a way that it could be released from above at any time. And then, as all the warriors grasped it, he pushed me forward, and I fell into the yawning abyss. After the first jerk, as I reached the end of the rope that had been paid out to let me fall below the pit's edge, they lowered me quickly but smoothly. The moment before the plunge, while 2 or 3 of the men had been assisting in adjusting the rope about me, one of them had brought his mouth close to my cheek, and in the brief interval before I was cast into the forbidding hole, he breathed a single word into my ear. Courage. The pit, which my imagination had pictured as bottomless, proved to be not more than 100 feet in depth, but as its walls were smoothly polished, it might as well have been 1,000 feet, for I could never hope to escape without outside assistance. Asterisk, 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 for a day I was left in darkness, and then, quite suddenly, a brilliant light illumined my strange cell. I was reasonably hungry and thirsty by this time, not having tasted food or drink since the day prior to my incarceration. To my amazement, I found the sides of the pit, that I had thought smooth, lined with shelves, upon which were the most delicious viands and liquid refreshments that Arkar afforded. With an exclamation of delight, I sprang forward to partake of some of the welcome food, but ere ever I reached it, the light was extinguished, and though I groped my way about the chamber, my hands came in contact with nothing beside the smooth, hard wall that I had felt on my first examination of my prison. Immediately, the pangs of hunger and thirst began to assail me. Where before I had had but a mild craving for food and drink, I now actually suffered for want of it, and all because of the tantalizing sight that I had had of food almost within my grasp. Once more darkness and silence enveloped me, a silence that was broken only by a single mocking laugh. Asterisk, 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 for another day, nothing occurred to break the monotony of my imprisonment or relieve the suffering superinduced by hunger and thirst. Slowly the pangs became less keen, as suffering deadened the activity of certain nerves, and then the light flashed on once again, and before me stood an array of new and tempting dishes, with great bottles of clear water and flagons of refreshing wine, upon the outside of which the cold sweat of condensation stood. Again, with the hunger madness of a wild beast, I sprang forward to seize those tempting dishes. But as before, the light went out, and I came to a sudden stop against a hard wall. Then the mocking laugh rang out for a second time. The pit of plenty. Ah, what a cruel mind must have devised this exquisite, hellish torture. Day after day was the thing repeated, until I was on the verge of madness. And then, as I had done in the pits of the Warhoons, I took a new, firm hold upon my reason and forced it back into the channels of sanity. By sheer willpower, I regained control over my tottering mentality, and so successful was I that the next time that the light came I sat quite still and looked indifferently at the fresh and tempting food almost within my reach. Glad I was that I had done so, for it gave me an opportunity to solve the seeming mystery of those vanishing banquets. As I made no move to reach the food, the torturers left the light turned on in the hope that at last I could refrain no longer from giving them the delicious thrill of enjoyment that my former futile efforts to obtain it had caused. And as I sat scrutinizing the laden shelves, I presently saw how the thing was accomplished, and so simple was it that I wondered I had not guessed it before. The wall of my prison was of clearest glass. Behind the glass were the tantalizing viands. After nearly an hour the light went out, but this time there was no mocking laughter, at least not upon the part of my tormentors. But I, to be at quits with them, gave a low laugh that none might mistake for the cackle of a maniac. Asterisk, 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 9 days passed, and I was weak from hunger and thirst, but no longer suffering. I was past that. Then, down through the darkness above, a little parcel fell to the floor at my side. Indifferently I groped for it, thinking it but some new invention of my jailers to add to my sufferings. At last I found it, a tiny package wrapped in paper at the end of a strong and slender cord. As I opened it, a few lozenges fell to the floor. As I gathered them up, feeling of them and smelling of them, I discovered that they were tablets of concentrated food, such as are quite common in all parts of Barsoom. Poison, I thought. Well, what of it? Why not end my misery now rather than drag out a few more wretched days in this dark pit? Slowly, I raised one of the little pellets to my lips. Goodbye, my Dejah Thoris, I breathed. I have lived for you and fought for you, and now my next dearest wish is to be realized, for I shall die for you. And taking the morsel in my mouth, I devoured it. One by one I ate them all, nor ever did anything taste better than those tiny bits of nourishment, within which I knew must lie the seeds of death, possibly of some hideous, torturing death. As I sat quietly upon the floor of my prison, waiting for the end, my fingers by accident came in contact with the bit of paper in which the things had been wrapped. And as I idly played with it, my mind roaming far back into the past, that I might live again for a few brief moments, before I died some of the many happy moments of a long and happy life, I became aware of strange protuberances upon the smooth surface of the parchment-like substance in my hands. For a time they carried no special significance to my mind. I merely was mildly wondrous that they were there. But at last they seemed to take form, and then I realized that there was but a single line of them, like writing. Now, more interestedly, my fingers traced and retraced them. There were 4 separate and distinct combinations of raised lines. Could it be that these were 4 words, and that they were intended to carry a message to me? The more I thought of it, the more excited I became, until my fingers raced madly back and forth over those bewildering little hills and valleys upon that bit of paper. But I could make nothing of them, and at last I decided that my very haste was preventing me from solving the mystery. Then I took it more slowly. Again and again, my forefinger traced the first of those 4 combinations. Martian writing is rather difficult to explain to an Earthman. It is something of a cross between shorthand and picture writing, and is an entirely different language from the spoken language of Mars. Upon Barsoom, there is but a single oral language. It is spoken today by every race and nation, just as it was at the beginning of human life upon Barsoom. It has grown with the growth of the planet's learning and scientific achievements. But so ingenious a thing it is that new words to express new thoughts, or describe new conditions or discoveries form themselves. No other word could explain the thing that a new word is required for other than the word that naturally falls to it. And so, no matter how far removed 2 nations or races, their spoken languages are identical. Not so their written languages, however. No 2 nations have the same written language, and often cities of the same nation have a written language that differs greatly from that of the nation to which they belong. Thus it was that the signs upon the paper, if in reality they were words, baffled me for some time. But at last I made out the first one. It was courage, and it was written in the letters of Marantina. Courage. That was the word the yellow guardsman had whispered in my ear as I stood upon the verge of the pit of plenty. The message must be from him, and he I knew was a friend. With renewed hope, I bent my every energy to the deciphering of the balance of the message, and at last success rewarded my endeavor. I had read the 4 words, courage. Chapter 12. Follow the rope. What could it mean? Follow the rope. What rope? Presently I recalled the cord that had been attached to the parcel when it fell at my side, and after a little groping, my hand came in contact with it again. It depended from above, and when I pulled upon it, I discovered that it was rigidly fastened, possibly at the pit's mouth. Upon examination, I found that the cord, though small, was amply able to sustain the weight of several men. Then I made another discovery. There was a second message knotted in the rope at about the height of my head. This I deciphered more easily now that the key was mine. Bring the rope with you. Beyond the knots lies danger. That was all there was to this message. It was evidently hastily formed, an afterthought. I did not pause longer than to learn the contents of the second message, and though I was none too sure of the meaning of the final admonition, beyond the knots lies danger, yet I was sure that here before me lay an avenue of escape, and that the sooner I took advantage of it, the more likely was I to win to liberty. At least, I could be but little worse off than I had been in the pit of plenty. I was to find, however, ere I was well out of that damnable hole, that I might have been very much worse off had I been compelled to remain there another 2 minutes. It had taken me about that length of time to ascend some 50 feet above the bottom, when a noise above attracted my attention. To my chagrin, I saw that the covering of the pit was being removed far above me, and in the light of the courtyard beyond I saw a number of yellow warriors. Could it be that I was laboriously working my way into some new trap? Were the messages spurious after all? And then, just as my hope and courage had ebbed to their lowest, I saw two things. One was the body of a huge, struggling, snarling apt being lowered over the side of the pit toward me, and the other was an aperture in the side of the shaft, an aperture larger than a man's body, into which my rope led. Just as I scrambled into the dark hole before me, the apt passed me, reaching out with his mighty hands to clutch me, and snapping, growling, and roaring in a most frightful manner. Plainly now I saw the end for which Salensus Al had destined me. After first torturing me with starvation, he had caused this fierce beast to be lowered into my prison to finish the work that the Jedak's hellish imagination had conceived. And then another truth flashed upon me. I had lived 9 days of the allotted 10, which must intervene before Salensus Al could make Dejah Thoris his queen. The purpose of the apt was to ensure my death before the 10th day. I almost laughed aloud as I thought how Salensus Al's measure of safety was to aid in defeating the very end he sought. For when they discovered that the apt was alone in the pit of plenty, they could not know but that he had completely devoured me, and so no suspicion of my escape would cause a search to be made for me. Coiling the rope that had carried me thus far upon my strange journey, I sought for the other end, but found that as I followed it forward, it extended always before me. So this was the meaning of the words, "Follow the rope." The tunnel through which I crawled was low and dark. I had followed it for several hundred yards when I felt a knot beneath my fingers. Beyond the knots lies danger. Now I went with the utmost caution, and a moment later a sharp turn in the tunnel brought me to an opening into a large, brilliantly lighted chamber. The trend of the tunnel I had been traversing had been slightly upward, and from this I judged that the chamber into which I now found myself looking must be either on the first floor of the palace or directly beneath the first floor. Upon the opposite wall were many strange instruments and devices, and in the center of the room stood a long table at which two men were seated in earnest conversation. He who faced me was a yellow man, a little wizened-up, pasty-faced old fellow with great eyes that showed the white round the entire circumference of the iris. His companion was a black man, and I did not need to see his face to know that it was Thurid, for there was no other of the first-born north of the ice barrier. Thurid was speaking as I came within hearing of the men's voices. "Salin," he was saying, "there is no risk, and the reward is great. You know that you hate Salensus Al, and that nothing would please you more than to thwart him in some cherished plan. There be nothing that he more cherishes today than the idea of wedding the beautiful princess of Helium. But I, too, want her, and with your help I may win her. You need not more than step from this room for an instant when I give you the signal. I will do the rest, and then, when I am gone, you may come and throw the great switch back into its place, and all will be as before. I need but an hour's start to be safe beyond the devilish power that you control in this hidden chamber beneath the palace of your master. See how easy." And with the words the black Dejah rose from his seat and, crossing the room, laid his hand upon a large, burnished lever that protruded from the opposite wall. "No, no," cried the little old man, springing after him with a wild shriek. "Not that one, not that one. That controls the sunray tanks, and should you pull it too far down, all Cadabra would be consumed by heat before I could replace it. Come away, come away. You know not with what mighty powers you play. This is the lever that you seek. Note well the symbol inlaid in white upon its ebon surface." Thurid approached and examined the handle of the lever. "Ah, a magnet," he said. "I will remember. It is settled, then I take it," he continued. The old man hesitated. A look of combined greed and apprehension overspread his none too beautiful features. "Double the figure," he said. "Even that were all too small an amount for the service you ask. Why, I risk my life by even entertaining you here within the forbidden precincts of my station. Should Salensus Al learn of it, he would have me thrown to the apts before the day was done." "He dare not do that, and you know it full well, Salin," contradicted the black. "Too great a power of life and death you hold over the people of Cadabra for Salensus Al ever to risk threatening you with death. Before ever his minions could lay their hands upon you, you might seize this very lever from which you have just warned me, and wipe out the entire city, and myself into the bargain, said Sarlin with a shudder. But if you were to die anyway, you would find the nerve to do it, replied Thurid. Yes, muttered Sarlin, I have often thought upon that very thing. Well, firstborn, is your red princess worth the price I ask for my services, or will you go without her and see her in the arms of Relentless all tomorrow night? Take your price, yellow man, replied Thurid with an oath, half now and the balance when you have fulfilled your contract. With that the Dejah threw a well-filled money pouch upon the table. Sarlin opened the pouch and with trembling fingers counted its contents. His weird eyes assumed a greedy expression, and his unkempt beard and mustache twitched with the muscles of his mouth and chin. It was quite evident from his very mannerism that Thurid had keenly guessed the man's weakness. Even the claw-like, clutching movement of the fingers betokened the avariciousness of the miser. Having satisfied himself that the amount was correct, Sarlin replaced the money in the pouch and rose from the table. Now, he said, are you quite sure that you know the way to your destination? You must travel quickly to cover the ground to the cave, and from thence beyond the great power, all within a brief hour, for no more dare I spare you. Let me repeat it to you, said Thurid, that you may see if I be letter perfect. Proceed, replied Sarlin. Through yonder door, he commenced, pointing to a door at the far end of the apartment. I follow a corridor, passing 3 diverging corridors upon my right, then into the 4th right-hand corridor straight to where 3 corridors meet. Here again I follow to the right, hugging the left wall closely to avoid the pit. At the end of this corridor, I shall come to a spiral runway, which I must follow down instead of up. After that the way is along but a single branchless corridor. Am I right? Quite right, Dejah, answered Sarlin. And now begone. Already have you tempted fate too long within this forbidden place. Tonight or tomorrow, then, you may expect the signal, said Thurid, rising to go. Tonight or tomorrow, repeated Sarlin, and as the door closed behind his guest, the old man continued to mutter as he turned back to the table, where he again dumped the contents of the money pouch, running his fingers through the heap of shining metal, piling the coins into little towers, counting, recounting, and fondling the wealth the while he muttered on and on in a crooning undertone. Presently his fingers ceased their play. His eyes popped wider than ever as they fastened upon the door through which Thurid had disappeared. The croon changed to a querulous muttering, and finally to an ugly growl. Then the old man rose from the table, shaking his fist at the closed door. Now he raised his voice, and his words came distinctly. Fool, he muttered, think you that for your happiness Sarlin will give up his life? If you escaped, Relentless all would know that only through my connivance could you have succeeded. Then would he send for me. What would you have me do? Reduce the city and myself to ashes? No, fool, there is a better way for Sarlin to keep thy money and be revenged upon Relentless all. He laughed in a nasty, cackling note. Poor fool, you may throw the great switch that will give you the freedom of the heir of Arkar, and then, in fatuous security, go on with thy red princess to the freedom of death. When you have passed beyond this chamber in your flight, what can prevent Sarlin replacing the switch as it was before your vile hand touched it? Nothing. And then the guardian of the north will claim you and your woman, and silence us all, when he sees your dead bodies, will never dream that the hand of Sarlin had aught to do with the thing. Then his voice dropped once more into mutterings that I could not translate, but I had heard enough to cause me to guess a great deal more, and I thanked the kind providence that had led me to this chamber at a time so filled with importance to Dejah Thoris and myself as this. But how to pass the old man now? The cord, almost invisible upon the floor, stretched straight across the apartment to a door upon the far side. There was no other way of which I knew, nor could I afford to ignore the advice to follow the rope. I must cross this room, but however I should accomplish it undetected with that old man in the very center of it baffled me. Of course I might have sprung in upon him, and with my bare hands silenced him forever, but I had heard enough to convince me that, with him, alive the knowledge that I had gained might serve me at some future moment. While should I kill him and another be stationed in his place, Thurid would not come hither with Dejah Thoris, as was quite evidently his intention. As I stood in the dark shadow of the tunnel's end, racking my brain for a feasible plan, the while I watched, cat-like, the old man's every move, he took up the money pouch and crossed to one end of the apartment, where, bending to his knees, he fumbled with a panel in the wall. Instantly, I guessed that here was the hiding place in which he hoarded his wealth, and while he bent there, his back toward me, I entered the chamber upon tiptoe, and with the utmost stealth essayed to reach the opposite side before he should complete his task and turn again toward the room's center. Scarcely 30 steps, all told, must I take, and yet it seemed to my overwrought imagination that that farther wall was miles away. But at last I reached it, nor once had I taken my eyes from the back of the old miser's head. He did not turn until my hand was upon the button that controlled the door through which my way led, and then he turned away from me as I passed through and gently closed the door. For an instant I paused, my ear close to the panel, to learn if he had suspected aught, but as no sound of pursuit came from within, I wheeled and made my way along the new corridor, following the rope, which I coiled and brought with me as I advanced. But a short distance farther on I came to the rope's end at a point where 5 corridors met. What was I to do? Which way should I turn? I was nonplussed. A careful examination of the end of the rope revealed the fact that it had been cleanly cut with some sharp instrument. This fact, and the words that had cautioned me that danger lay beyond the knots, convinced me that the rope had been severed since my friend had placed it as my guide. For I had but passed a single knot, whereas there had evidently been 2 or more in the entire length of the cord. Now, indeed, was I in a pretty fix, for neither did I know which avenue to follow nor when danger lay directly in my path. But there was nothing else to be done than follow one of the corridors, for I could gain nothing by remaining where I was. So I chose the central opening and passed on into its gloomy depths with a prayer upon my lips. The floor of the tunnel rose rapidly as I advanced, and a moment later the way came to an abrupt end before a heavy door. I could hear nothing beyond, and with my accustomed rashness, pushed the portal wide to step into a room filled with yellow warriors. The first to see me opened his eyes wide in astonishment, and at the same instant I felt the tingling sensation in my finger that denoted the presence of a friend of the ring. Then others saw me, and there was a concerted rush to lay hands upon me, for these were all members of the palace guard, men familiar with my face. The first to reach me was the wearer of the mate to my strange ring, and as he came close he whispered, "Surrender to me." Then in a loud voice shouted, "You are my prisoner, white man," and menaced me with his 2 weapons. And so John Carter, Prince of Helium, meekly surrendered to a single antagonist. The others now swarmed about us, asking many questions, but I would not talk to them, and finally my captor announced that he would lead me back to my cell. An officer ordered several other warriors to accompany him, and a moment later we were retracing the way I had just come. My friend walked close beside me, asking many silly questions about the country from which I had come, until finally his fellows paid no further attention to him or his gabbling. Gradually, as he spoke, he lowered his voice, so that presently he was able to converse with me in a low tone without attracting attention. His ruse was a clever one, and showed that Talu had not misjudged the man's fitness for the dangerous duty upon which he was detailed. When he had fully assured himself that the other guardsmen were not listening, he asked me why I had not followed the rope, and when I told him that it had ended at the 5 corridors, he said that it must have been cut by someone in need of a piece of rope, for he was sure that the stupid cadabrans would never have guessed its purpose. Before we had reached the spot from which the 5 corridors diverge, my Marantinian friend had managed to drop to the rear of the little column with me, and when we came in sight of the branching ways, he whispered, "Run up the first upon the right. It leads to the watchtower upon the south wall. I will direct the pursuit up the next corridor." And with that, he gave me a great shove into the dark mouth of the tunnel, at the same time crying out in simulated pain and alarm as he threw himself upon the floor as though I had felled him with a blow. From behind the voices of the excited guardsmen came reverberating along the corridor, suddenly growing fainter as Talu's spy led them up the wrong passageway in fancied pursuit. As I ran for my life through the dark galleries beneath the palace of Silences All, I must indeed have presented a remarkable appearance, had there been any to note it, for though death loomed large about me, my face was split by a broad grin as I thought of the resourcefulness of the nameless hero of Marantina to whom I owed my life. Of such stuff are the men of my beloved Helium, and when I meet another of their kind, of whatever race or color, my heart goes out to him as it did now to my new friend who had risked his life for me simply because I wore the mate to the ring his ruler had put upon his finger. The corridor along which I ran led almost straight for a considerable distance, terminating at the foot of a spiral runway. up which I proceeded to emerge presently into a circular chamber upon the first floor of a tower. In this apartment, a dozen red slaves were employed polishing or repairing the weapons of the yellow men. The walls of the room were lined with racks in which were hundreds of straight and hooked swords, javelins, and daggers. It was evidently an armory. There were but 3 warriors guarding the workers. My eyes took in the entire scene at a glance. Here were weapons in plenty. Here were sinewy red warriors to wield them. And here now was John Carter, Prince of Helium, in need both of weapons and warriors. As I stepped into the apartment, guards and prisoners saw me simultaneously. Close to the entrance where I stood was a rack of straight swords, and as my hand closed upon the hilt of one of them, my eyes fell upon the faces of 2 of the prisoners who worked side by side. One of the guards started toward me. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What do you here?" "I come for Tardos Mors, Jeddak of Helium, and his son Mors Kajak," I cried, pointing to the 2 red prisoners who had now sprung to their feet, wide-eyed in astonished recognition. "Rise, red men. Before we die, let us leave a memorial in the palace of Arkar's tyrant that will stand forever in the annals of Cadabra to the honor and glory of Helium." For I had seen that all the prisoners there were men of Tardos Mors' navy. Then the first guardsman was upon me, and the fight was on. But scarce did we engage ere, to my horror, I saw that the red slaves were shackled to the floor. Chapter 13. The Magnet Switch. The guardsmen paid not the slightest attention to their wards, for the red men could not move over 2 feet from the great rings to which they were padlocked, though each had seized a weapon upon which he had been engaged when I entered the room, and stood ready to join me could they have but done so. The yellow men devoted all their attention to me, nor were they long in discovering that the 3 of them were none too many to defend the armory against John Carter. Would that I had had my own good long sword in my hand that day. But as it was, I rendered a satisfactory account of myself with the unfamiliar weapon of the yellow man. At first, I had a time of it dodging their villainous hook swords, but after a minute or 2 I had succeeded in wresting a second straight sword from one of the racks along the wall, and thereafter, using it to parry the hooks of my antagonists, I felt more evenly equipped. The 3 of them were on me at once, and but for a lucky circumstance, my end might have come quickly. The foremost guardsman made a vicious lunge for my side with his hook after the 3 of them had backed me against the wall, but as I sidestepped and raised my arm, his weapon but grazed my side, passing into a rack of javelins, where it became entangled. Before he could release it, I had run him through, and then, falling back upon the tactics that have saved me 100 times in tight pinches, I rushed the 2 remaining warriors, forcing them back with a perfect torrent of cuts and thrusts, weaving my sword in and out about their guards until I had the fear of death upon them. Then one of them commenced calling for help, but it was too late to save them. They were as putty in my hands now, and I backed them about the armory as I would until I had them where I wanted them, within reach of the swords of the shackled slaves. In an instant, both lay dead upon the floor, but their cries had not been entirely fruitless, for now I heard answering shouts, and the footfalls of many men running, and the clank of accoutrements and the commands of officers. "The door! Quick, John Carter, bar the door!" cried Tardos Mors. Already the guard was in sight, charging across the open court that was visible through the doorway. A dozen seconds would bring them into the tower. A single leap carried me to the heavy portal. With a resounding bang, I slammed it shut. "The bar!" shouted Tardos Mors. I tried to slip the huge fastening into place, but it defied my every attempt. "Raise it a little to release the catch," cried one of the red men. I could hear the yellow warriors leaping along the flagging just beyond the door. I raised the bar and shot it to the right just as the foremost of the guardsmen threw himself against the opposite side of the massive panels. The barrier held. I had been in time, but by the fraction of a second only. Now I turned my attention to the prisoners. To Tardos Mors I went first, asking where the keys might be which would unfasten their fetters. "The officer of the guard has them," replied the Jeddak of Helium, "and he is among those without who seek entrance. You will have to force them." Most of the prisoners were already hacking at their bonds with the swords in their hands. The yellow men were battering at the door with javelins and axes. I turned my attention to the chains that held Tardos Mors. Again and again I cut deep into the metal with my sharp blade, but ever faster and faster fell the torrent of blows upon the portal. At last, a link parted beneath my efforts, and a moment later Tardos Mors was free. though a few inches of trailing chain still dangled from his ankle. A splinter of wood falling inward from the door announced the headway that our enemies were making toward us. The mighty panels trembled and bent beneath the furious onslaught of the enraged yellow men. What with the battering upon the door and the hacking of the red men at their chains, the din within the armory was appalling. No sooner was Tardos Mors free than he turned his attention to another of the prisoners, while I set to work to liberate Mors Kajak. We must work fast if we would have all those fetters cut before the door gave way. Now, a panel crashed inward upon the floor, and Mors Kajak sprang to the opening to defend the way until we should have time to release the others. With javelins snatched from the wall, he wrought havoc among the foremost of the Arcarians, while we battled with the insensate metal that stood between our fellows and freedom. At length, all but one of the prisoners were freed, and then the door fell with a mighty crash before a hastily improvised battering ram, and the yellow horde was upon us. "To the upper chambers," shouted the red man who was still fettered to the floor. "To the upper chambers. There you may defend the tower against all Cadabra. Do not delay because of me, who could pray for no better death than in the service of Tardos Mors and the Prince of Helium. But I would have sacrificed the life of every man of us rather than desert a single red man, much less the lion-hearted hero who begged us to leave him. Cut his chains," I cried to two of the red men, while the balance of us hold off the foe. There were 10 of us now to do battle with the Arcarian guard, and I warrant that ancient watchtower never looked down upon a more hotly contested battle than took place that day within its own grim walls. The first inrushing wave of yellow warriors recoiled from the slashing blades of 10 of Helium's veteran fighting men. A dozen Arcarian corpses blocked the doorway, but over the gruesome barrier a score more of their fellows dashed, shouting their hoarse and hideous war cry. Upon the bloody mound we met them, hand to hand, stabbing where the quarters were too close to cut, thrusting when we could push a foeman to arm's length. And mingled with the wild cry of the Arcarian there rose and fell the glorious words, "For Helium! For Helium!" that for countless ages have spurred on the bravest of the brave to those deeds of valor that have sent the fame of Helium's heroes broadcast throughout the length and breadth of a world. Now were the fetters struck from the last of the red men, and 13 strong we met each new charge of the soldiers of Salensus Arl. Scarce one of us but bled from a score of wounds, yet none had fallen. From without we saw hundreds of guardsmen pouring into the courtyard, and along the lower corridor from which I had found my way to the armory, we could hear the clank of metal and the shouting of men. In a moment we should be attacked from 2 sides, and with all our prowess we could not hope to withstand the unequal odds which would thus divide our attention and our small numbers. "To the upper chambers," cried Tardos Mors, and a moment later we fell back toward the runway that led to the floors above. Here another bloody battle was waged with the force of yellow men who charged into the armory as we fell back from the doorway. Here we lost our first man, a noble fellow whom we could ill spare. But at length all had backed into the runway except myself, who remained to hold back the Arcarians until the others were safe above. In the mouth of the narrow spiral, but a single warrior could attack me at a time, so that I had little difficulty in holding them all back for the brief moment that was necessary. Then, backing slowly before them, I commenced the ascent of the spiral. All the long way to the towers, the guardsmen pressed me closely. When one went down before my sword, another scrambled over the dead man to take his place. And thus, taking an awful toll with each few feet gained, I came to the spacious glass-walled watchtower of Cadabra. Here my companions clustered ready to take my place, and for a moment's respite I stepped to one side while they held the enemy off. From the lofty perch, a view could be had for miles in every direction. Toward the south stretched the rugged, ice-clad waste to the edge of the mighty barrier. Toward the east and west, and dimly toward the north, I descried other Arcarian cities, while in the immediate foreground, just beyond the walls of Cadabra, the grim guardian shaft reared its Sama head. Then I cast my eyes down into the streets of Cadabra, from which a sudden tumult had arisen, and there I saw a battle raging, and beyond the city's walls, I saw armed men marching in great columns toward a nearby gate. Eagerly I pressed forward against the glass wall of the observatory, scarce daring to credit the testimony of my own eyes. But at last I could doubt no longer, and with a shout of joy that rose strangely in the midst of the cursing and groaning of the battling men at the entrance to the chamber, I called to Tardo's Moors. As he joined me, I pointed down into the streets of Cadabra and to the advancing columns beyond, above which floated bravely in the Arctic air the flags and banners of Helium. An instant later, every red man in the lofty chamber had seen the inspiring sight, and such a shout of thanksgiving arose as I warrant never before echoed through that age-old pile of stone. But still we must fight on, for though our troops had entered Cadabra, the city was yet far from capitulation, nor had the palace been even assaulted. Turn and turn about we held the top of the runway, while the others feasted their eyes upon the sight of our valiant countrymen battling far beneath us. Now they have rushed the palace gate. Great battering rams are dashed against its formidable surface. Now they are repulsed by a deadly shower of javelins from the wall's top. Once again they charge, but a sortie by a large force of Arcarians from an intersecting avenue crumples the head of the column, and the men of Helium go down, fighting, beneath an overwhelming force. The palace gate flies open, and a force of the Jedak's own guard, picked men from the flower of the Arcarian army, sallies forth to shatter the broken regiments. For a moment it looks as though nothing could avert defeat, and then I see a noble figure upon a mighty thoat, not the tiny thoat of the Red Man, but one of his huge cousins of the dead sea bottoms. The warrior hews his way to the front, and behind him rally the disorganized soldiers of Helium. As he raises his head aloft to fling a challenge at the men upon the palace walls, I see his face, and my heart swells in pride and happiness as the red warriors leap to the side of their leader and win back the ground that they had but just lost. The face of him upon the mighty thoat is the face of my son, Thoris of Helium. At his side fights a huge Martian warhound, nor did I need a second look to know that it was Wooler, my faithful Wooler, who had thus well performed his arduous task and brought the succoring legions in the nick of time. In the nick of time. Who yet might say that they were not too late to save, but surely they could avenge, and such retribution as that unconquered army would deal out to the hateful Arcarians. I sighed to think that I might not be alive to witness it. Again, I turned to the windows. The red men had not yet forced the outer palace wall, but they were fighting nobly against the best that Arcar afforded, valiant warriors who contested every inch of the way. Now my attention was caught by a new element without the city wall, a great body of mounted warriors looming large above the red men. They were the huge green allies of Helium, the savage hordes from the dead sea bottoms of the far south. In grim and terrible silence, they sped on toward the gate, the padded hoofs of their frightful mounts giving forth no sound. Into the doomed city they charged, and as they wheeled across the wide plaza before the palace of the Jedak of Jedaks, I saw, riding at their head, the mighty figure of their mighty leader, Tarkas, Jedak of Thark. My wish, then, was to be gratified, for I was to see my old friend battling once again, and though not shoulder to shoulder with him, I, too, would be fighting in the same cause here in the high tower of Arcar. Nor did it seem that our foes would ever cease their stubborn attacks, for still they came, though the way to our chamber was often clogged with the bodies of their dead. At times they would pause long enough to drag back the impeding corpses, and then fresh warriors would forge upward to taste the cup of death. I had been taking my turn with the others in defending the approach to our lofty retreat when Mors Kajak, who had been watching the battle in the street below, called aloud in sudden excitement. There was a note of apprehension in his voice that brought me to his side the instant that I could turn my place over to another, and as I reached him, he pointed far out across the waste of snow and ice toward the southern horizon. "Alas," he cried, "that I should be forced to witness cruel fate betray them without power to warn or aid, but they be past either now." As I looked in the direction he indicated, I saw the cause of his perturbation. A mighty fleet of flyers was approaching majestically toward Cadabra from the direction of the ice barrier. On and on they came with ever-increasing velocity. "The grim shaft that they call the Guardian of the North is beckoning to them," said Mors Kajak sadly, "just as it beckoned to Tardo's Moors and his great fleet. See where they lie, crumpled and broken, a grim and terrible monument to the mighty force of destruction which naught can resist." I, too, saw, but something else I saw that Mors Kajak did not. In my mind's eye I saw a buried chamber whose walls were lined with strange instruments and devices. In the center of the chamber was a long table, and before it sat a little pop-eyed old man counting his money. But plainest of all, I saw upon the wall a great switch with a small magnet inlaid within the surface of its black handle. Then I glanced out at the fast-approaching fleet. In 5 minutes, that mighty armada of the skies would be bent and worthless scrap, lying at the base of the shaft beyond the city's wall, and yellow hordes would be loosed from another gate to rush out upon the few survivors, stumbling blindly down through the mass of wreckage. Then the Apps would come. I shuddered at the thought, for I could vividly picture the whole horrible scene. Quick have I always been to decide and act. The impulse that moves me and the doing of the thing seems simultaneous. For if my mind goes through the tedious formality of reasoning, it must be a subconscious act of which I am not objectively aware. Psychologists tell me that, as the subconscious does not reason, too close a scrutiny of my mental activities might prove anything but flattering. But be that as it may, I have often won success, while the thinker would have been still at the endless task of comparing various judgments. And now celerity of action was the prime essential to the success of the thing that I had decided upon. Grasping my sword more firmly in my hand, I called to the red man at the opening to the runway to stand aside. "Way for the Prince of Helium," I shouted, and before the astonished yellow man, whose misfortune it was to be at the fighting end of the line at that particular moment, could gather his wits together, my sword had decapitated him, and I was rushing like a mad bull down upon those behind him. "Way for the Prince of Helium," I shouted as I cut a path through the astonished guardsmen of Salensus All. Hewing to right and left, I beat my way down that warrior-choked spiral until, near the bottom, those below, thinking that an army was descending upon them, turned and fled. The armory at the first floor was vacant when I entered it, the last of the Arcarians having fled into the courtyard. So none saw me continue down the spiral, toward the corridor beneath. Here I ran as rapidly as my legs would carry me toward the 5 corners, and there plunged into the passageway that led to the station of the old miser. Without the formality of a knock, I burst into the room. There sat the old man at his table, but as he saw me he sprang to his feet, drawing his sword. With scarce more than a glance toward him, I leaped for the great switch. But quick as I was, that wiry old fellow was there before me. How he did it I shall never know, nor does it seem credible that any Martian-born creature could approximate the marvelous speed of my earthly muscles. Like a tiger he turned upon me, and I was quick to see why Salin had been chosen for this important duty. Never in all my life have I seen such wondrous swordsmanship and such uncanny agility as that ancient bag of bones displayed. He was in 40 places at the same time, and before I had half a chance to awaken to my danger, he was like to have made a monkey of me, and a dead monkey at that. It is strange how new and unexpected conditions bring out unguessed ability to meet them. That day in the buried chamber beneath the palace of Salensus All, I learned what swordsmanship meant, and to what heights of sword mastery I could achieve when pitted against such a wizard of the blade as Salin. For a time he liked to have bested me, but presently the latent possibilities that must have been lying dormant within me for a lifetime came to the fore, and I fought as I had never dreamed a human being could fight. That duel royal should have taken place in the dark recesses of a cellar, without a single appreciative eye to witness, it has always seemed to me almost a world calamity, at least from the viewpoint Barsoomian, where bloody strife is the first and greatest consideration of individuals, nations, and races. I was fighting to reach the switch, Salin to prevent me, and though we stood not 3 feet from it, I could not win an inch toward it, for he forced me back an inch for the first 5 minutes of our battle. I knew that if I were to throw it in time to save the oncoming fleet, it must be done in the next few seconds, and so I tried my old rushing tactics, but I might as well have rushed a brick wall for all that Salin gave way. In fact, I came near to impaling myself upon his point for my pains, but right was on my side, and I think that that must give a man greater confidence than though he knew himself to be battling in a wicked cause. At least, I did not want in confidence, and when I next rushed Salin, it was to one side with implicit confidence that he must turn to meet my new line of attack, and turn he did, so that now we fought with our sides towards the coveted goal. The great switch stood within my reach upon my right hand. To uncover my breast for an instant would have been to court sudden death, but I saw no other way than to chance it, if by so doing I might rescue that oncoming, succoring fleet. And so, in the face of a wicked sword thrust, I reached out my point and caught the great switch a sudden blow that released it from its seating. So surprised and horrified was Sarlan that he forgot to finish his thrust. Instead, he wheeled toward the switch with a loud shriek, a shriek which was his last, for before his hand could touch the lever it sought, my sword's point had passed through his heart. Chapter 14. The Tide of Battle. But Sarlan's last loud cry had not been without effect, for a moment later a dozen guardsmen burst into the chamber, though not before I had so bent and demolished the great switch that it could not be again used to turn the powerful current into the mighty magnet of destruction it controlled. The result of the sudden coming of the guardsmen had been to compel me to seek seclusion in the first passageway that I could find, and that to my disappointment proved to be not the one with which I was familiar, but another upon its left. They must have either heard or guessed which way I went, for I had proceeded but a short distance when I heard the sound of pursuit. I had no mind to stop and fight these men here when there was fighting aplenty elsewhere in the city of Cadabra, fighting that could be of much more avail to me and mine than useless life-taking far below the palace. But the fellows were pressing me, and as I did not know the way at all, I soon saw that they would overtake me unless I found a place to conceal myself until they had passed, which would then give me an opportunity to return the way I had come and regain the tower, or possibly find a way to reach the city streets. The passageway had risen rapidly since leaving the apartment of the switch, and now ran level and well lighted straight into the distance as far as I could see. The moment that my pursuers reached this straight stretch, I would be in plain sight of them, with no chance to escape from the corridor undetected. Presently I saw a series of doors opening from either side of the corridor, and as they all looked alike to me, I tried the first one that I reached. It opened into a small chamber, luxuriously furnished, and was evidently an antechamber of some office or audience chamber of the palace. On the far side was a heavily curtained doorway, beyond which I heard the hum of voices. Instantly I crossed the small chamber, and parting the curtains, looked within the larger apartment. Before me were a party of perhaps 50 gorgeously clad nobles of the court, standing before a throne upon which sat Salensus Al. The Jeddak of Jeddaks was addressing them. "The allotted hour has come," he was saying as I entered the apartment, "and though the enemies of Arkar be within her gates, naught may stay the will of Salensus Al. The great ceremony must be omitted, that no single man may be kept from his place. In the defences, other than the 50 that custom demands, shall witness the creation of a new queen in Arkar. In a moment the thing shall have been done, and we may return to the battle, while she who is now the Princess of Helium looks down from the Queen's tower upon the annihilation of her former countrymen, and witnesses the greatness which is her husband's." Then, turning to a courtier, he issued some command in a low voice. The addressed hastened to a small door at the far end of the chamber, and swinging it wide, cried, "Way for Dejah Thoris, future Queen of Arkar." Immediately 2 guardsmen appeared dragging the unwilling bride toward the altar. Her hands were still manacled behind her, evidently to prevent suicide. Her disheveled hair and panting bosom betokened that, chained though she was, still had she fought against the thing that they would do to her. At sight of her, Salensus Al rose and drew his sword, and the sword of each of the 50 nobles was raised on high to form an arch, beneath which the poor, beautiful creature was dragged toward her doom. A grim smile forced itself to my lips as I thought of the rude awakening that lay in store for the ruler of Arkar, and my itching fingers fondled the hilt of my bloody sword as I watched the procession that moved slowly toward the throne, a procession which consisted of but a handful of priests, who followed Dejah Thoris and the 2 guardsmen. I caught a fleeting glimpse of a black face peering from behind the draperies that covered the wall back of the dais, upon which stood Salensus Al, awaiting his bride. Now the guardsmen were forcing the Princess of Helium up the few steps to the side of the tyrant of Arkar, and I had no eyes and no thoughts for aught else. A priest opened a book, and raising his hand, commenced to drone out a sing-song ritual. Salensus Al reached for the hand of his bride. I had intended waiting until some circumstance should give me a reasonable hope of success, for even though the entire ceremony should be completed, there could be no valid marriage while I lived. What I was most concerned in, of course, was the rescuing of Dejah Thoris. I wished to take her from the palace of Salensus Al, if such a thing were possible, but whether it were accomplished before or after the mock marriage was a matter of secondary import. When, however, I saw the vile hand of Silence's All reach out for the hand of my beloved princess, I could restrain myself no longer. And before the nobles of Arkar knew that aught had happened, I had leaped through their thin line and was upon the dais beside Dejah Thoris and Silence's All. With the flat of my sword, I struck down his polluting hand, and grasping Dejah Thoris round the waist, I swung her behind me as, with my back against the draperies of the dais, I faced the tyrant of the north and his roomful of noble warriors. The Jeddak of Jeddaks was a great mountain of a man, a coarse, brutal beast of a man, and as he towered above me there, his fierce black whiskers and mustache bristling in rage, I can well imagine that a less seasoned warrior might have trembled before him. With a snarl, he sprang toward me with naked sword, but whether Silence's All was a good swordsman or a poor one, I never learned. For with Dejah Thoris at my back, I was no longer human. I was a superman, and no man could have withstood me then. With a single, lo, for the princess of Helium, I ran my blade straight through the rotten heart of Arkar's rotten ruler, and before the white, drawn faces of his nobles Silence's All rolled, grinning in horrible death, to the foot of the steps below his marriage throne. For a moment, tense silence reigned in the nuptial room. Then the 50 nobles rushed upon me. Furiously we fought, but the advantage was mine, for I stood upon a raised platform above them, and I fought for the most glorious woman of a glorious race, and I fought for a great love, and for the mother of my boy. And from behind my shoulder, in the silvery cadence of that dear voice, rose the brave battle anthem of Helium, which the nation's women sing as their men march out to victory. That alone was enough to inspire me to victory over even greater odds, and I verily believe that I should have bested the entire roomful of yellow warriors that day in the nuptial chamber of the palace at Cadabra, had not interruption come to my aid. Fast and furious was the fighting as the nobles of Silence's All sprang, time and again, up the steps before the throne, only to fall back before a sword hand that seemed to have gained a new wizardry from its experience with the cunning Sarlan. Two were pressing me so closely that I could not turn when I heard a movement behind me and noted that the sound of the battle anthem had ceased. Was Dejah Thoris preparing to take her place beside me? Heroic daughter of a heroic world. It would not be unlike her to have seized a sword and fought at my side, for though the women of Mars are not trained in the arts of war, the spirit is theirs, and they have been known to do that very thing upon countless occasions. But she did not come, and glad I was, for it would have doubled my burden in protecting her before I should have been able to force her back again out of harm's way. She must be contemplating some cunning strategy, I thought, and so I fought on secure in the belief that my divine princess stood close behind me. For half an hour at least I must have fought there against the nobles of Arkar, ere ever one placed a foot upon the dais where I stood, and then of a sudden all that remained of them formed below me for a last, mad, desperate charge. But even as they advanced, the door at the far end of the chamber swung wide, and a wild-eyed messenger sprang into the room. "The Jeddak of Jeddaks," he cried. "Where is the Jeddak of Jeddaks? The city has fallen before the hordes from beyond the barrier, and but now the great gate of the palace itself has been forced, and the warriors of the south are pouring into its sacred precincts. Where is Silence's All? He alone may revive the flagging courage of our warriors. He alone may save the day for Arkar. Where is Silence's All?" The nobles stepped back from about the dead body of their ruler, and one of them pointed to the grinning corpse. The messenger staggered back in horror, as though from a blow in the face. "Then fly, nobles of Arkar," he cried, "for naught can save you. Hark, they come." As he spoke, we heard the deep roar of angry men from the corridor without, and the clank of metal and the clang of swords. Without another glance toward me, who had stood a spectator of the tragic scene, the nobles wheeled and fled from the apartment through another exit. Almost immediately, a force of yellow warriors appeared in the doorway through which the messenger had come. They were backing toward the apartment, stubbornly resisting the advance of a handful of red men who faced them and forced them slowly but inevitably back. Above the heads of the contestants, I could see from my elevated station upon the dais the face of my old friend Kantos Kan. He was leading the little party that had won its way into the very heart of the palace of Silence's All. In an instant, I saw that by attacking the Arcarians from the rear I could so quickly disorganize them that their further resistance would be short-lived. And with this idea in mind, I sprang from the dais. casting a word of explanation to Dejah Thoris over my shoulder, though I did not turn to look at her. With myself ever between her enemies and herself, and with Cantos, Can, and his warriors winning to the apartment, there could be no danger to Dejah Thoris, standing there alone beside the throne. I wanted the men of Helium to see me, and to know that their beloved princess was here, too, for I knew that this knowledge would inspire them to even greater deeds of valor than they had performed in the past, though great indeed must have been those which won for them a way into the almost impregnable palace of the tyrant of the north. As I crossed the chamber to attack the Cadabrans from the rear, a small doorway at my left opened, and to my surprise revealed the figures of Mad-Eye Shang, father of Therns, and Fedor, his daughter, peering into the room. A quick glance about they took. Their eyes rested for a moment, wide in horror, upon the dead body of Relentless, upon the blood that crimsoned the floor, upon the corpses of the nobles who had fallen thick before the throne, upon me, upon the battling warriors at the other door. They did not essay to enter the apartment, but scanned its every corner from where they stood, and then, when their eyes had sought its entire area, a look of fierce rage overspread the features of Mad-Eye Shang, and a cold and cunning smile touched the lips of Fedor. Then they were gone, but not before a taunting laugh was thrown directly in my face by the woman. I did not understand then the meaning of Mad-Eye Shang's rage or Fedor's pleasure, but I knew that neither boded good for me. A moment later I was upon the backs of the yellow men, and as the red men of Helium saw me above the shoulders of their antagonists, a great shout rang through the corridor, and for a moment drowned the noise of battle. "For the Prince of Helium," they cried. "For the Prince of Helium." And, like hungry lions upon their prey, they fell once more upon the weakening warriors of the north. The yellow men, cornered between two enemies, fought with the desperation that utter hopelessness often induces. Fought as I should have fought had I been in their stead, with the determination to take as many of my enemies with me when I died as lay within the power of my sword arm. It was a glorious battle, but the end seemed inevitable, when presently from down the corridor behind the red men came a great body of reinforcing yellow warriors. Now were the tables turned, and it was the men of Helium, who seemed doomed to be ground between two millstones. All were compelled to turn to meet this new assault by a greatly superior force, so that to me was left the remnants of the yellow men within the throne room. They kept me busy, too, so busy that I began to wonder if indeed I should ever be done with them. Slowly they pressed me back into the room, and when they had all passed in after me, one of them closed and bolted the door, effectually barring the way against the men of Cantos Can. It was a clever move, for it put me at the mercy of a dozen men within a chamber from which assistance was locked out, and it gave the red men in the corridor beyond no avenue of escape should their new antagonists press them too closely. But I have faced heavier odds myself than were pitted against me that day, and I knew that Cantos Can had battled his way from 100 more dangerous traps than that in which he now was. So it was with no feelings of despair that I turned my attention to the business of the moment. Constantly my thoughts reverted to Dejah Thoris, and I longed for the moment when, the fighting done, I could fold her in my arms, and hear once more the words of love which had been denied me for so many years. During the fighting in the chamber, I had not even a single chance to so much as steal a glance at her, where she stood behind me beside the throne of the dead ruler. I wondered why she no longer urged me on with the strains of the martial hymn of Helium, but I did not need more than the knowledge that I was battling for her to bring out the best that is in me. It would be wearisome to narrate the details of that bloody struggle, of how we fought from the doorway, the full length of the room to the very foot of the throne, before the last of my antagonists fell with my blade piercing his heart. And then, with a glad cry, I turned with outstretched arms to seize my princess, and as my lips smothered hers to reap the reward that would be thrice ample payment for the bloody encounters through which I had passed for her dear sake from the South Pole to the North, the glad cry died, frozen upon my lips. My arms dropped limp and lifeless to my sides. As one who reels beneath the burden of a mortal wound, I staggered up the steps before the throne. Dejah Thoris was gone. Chapter 15. Rewards. With the realization that Dejah Thoris was no longer within the throne room came the belated recollection of the dark face that I had glimpsed peering from behind the draperies that backed the throne of Relentless at the moment that I had first come so unexpectedly upon the strange scene being enacted within the chamber. Why had the sight of that evil countenance not warned me to greater caution? Why had I permitted the rapid development of new situations to efface the recollection of that menacing danger? But alas, vain regret would not erase the calamity that had befallen. Once again had Dejah Thoris fallen into the clutches of that arch-fiend, Thurid, the black Dejah of the firstborn. Again was all my arduous labor gone for naught. Now I realized the cause of the rage that had been writ so large upon the features of Mad-Eye Shang, and the cruel pleasure that I had seen upon the face of Fedor. They had known or guessed the truth, and the Hecador of the Holy Therns, who had evidently come to the chamber in the hope of thwarting Silenceus Arl in his contemplated perfidy against the high priest who coveted Dejah Thoris for himself, realized that Thurid had stolen the prize from beneath his very nose. Fedor's pleasure had been due to her realization of what this last cruel blow would mean to me, as well as to a partial satisfaction of her jealous hatred for the Princess of Helium. My first thought was to look beyond the draperies at the back of the throne, for there it was that I had seen Thurid. With a single jerk, I tore the priceless stuff from its fastenings, and there before me was revealed a narrow doorway behind the throne. No question entered my mind but that here lay the opening of the avenue of escape which Thurid had followed, and had there been, it would have been dissipated by the sight of a tiny, jeweled ornament which lay a few steps within the corridor beyond. As I snatched up the bauble, I saw that it bore the device of the Princess of Helium, and then pressing it to my lips, I dashed madly along the winding way that led gently downward toward the lower galleries of the palace. I had followed but a short distance when I came upon the room in which Salin formerly had held sway. His dead body still lay where I had left it, nor was there any sign that another had passed through the room since I had been there. But I knew that two had done so, Thurid, the black Dejah, and Dejah Thoris. For a moment I paused uncertain as to which of the several exits from the apartment would lead me upon the right path. I tried to recollect the directions which I had heard Thurid repeat to Salin, and at last, slowly, as though through a heavy fog, the memory of the words of the firstborn came to me. Follow a corridor, passing 3 diverging corridors upon the right, then into the 4th right-hand corridor to where 3 corridors meet. Here again follow to the right, hugging the left wall closely to avoid the pit. At the end of this corridor, I shall come to a spiral runway which I must follow down instead of up. After that the way is a long but a single branchless corridor, and I recalled the exit at which he had pointed as he spoke. It did not take me long to start upon that unknown way, nor did I go with caution, although I knew that there might be grave dangers before me. Part of the way was black as sin, but for the most it was fairly well lighted. The stretch where I must hug the left wall to avoid the pits was darkest of them all, and I was nearly over the edge of the abyss before I knew that I was near the danger spot. A narrow ledge, scarce a foot wide, was all that had been left to carry the initiated past that frightful cavity into which the unknowing must surely have toppled at the first step. But at last I had won safely beyond it, and then a feeble light made the balance of the way plain until, at the end of the last corridor, I came suddenly out into the glare of day upon a field of snow and ice. Clad for the warm atmosphere of the hothouse city of Cadabra, the sudden change to Arctic frigidity was anything but pleasant. But the worst of it was that I knew I could not endure the bitter cold, almost naked as I was, and that I would perish before ever I could overtake Thurid and Dejah Thoris. To be thus blocked by nature, who had had all the arts and wiles of cunning man pitted against him, seemed a cruel fate, and as I staggered back into the warmth of the tunnel's end, I was as near hopelessness as I ever have been. I had by no means given up my intention of continuing the pursuit, for if needs be I would go ahead though I perished ere ever I reached my goal. But if there were a safer way, it were well worth the delay to attempt to discover it, that I might come again to the side of Dejah Thoris in fit condition to do battle for her. Scarce had I returned to the tunnel than I stumbled over a portion of a fur garment that seemed fastened to the floor of the corridor close to the wall. In the darkness I could not see what held it, but by groping with my hands I discovered that it was wedged beneath the bottom of a closed door. Pushing the portal aside, I found myself upon the threshold of a small chamber, the walls of which were lined with hooks from which depended suits of the complete outdoor apparel of the Yellow Men. Situated as it was at the mouth of a tunnel leading from the palace, it was quite evident that this was the dressing room used by the nobles leaving and entering the Heart-house city, and that Thurid, having knowledge of it, had stopped here to outfit himself and Dejah Thoris before venturing into the bitter cold of the Arctic world beyond. In his haste, he had dropped several garments upon the floor, and the telltale fur that had fallen partly within the corridor had proved the means of guiding me to the very spot he would least have wished me to have knowledge of. It required but the matter of a few seconds to don the necessary orluk skin clothing, with the heavy, fur-lined boots that are so essential a part of the garmenture of one who would successfully contend with the frozen trails and the icy winds of the bleak Northland. Once more I stepped beyond the tunnel's mouth to find the fresh tracks of Thurid and Dejah Thoris in the new-fallen snow. Now, at last, was my task an easy one, for though the going was rough in the extreme, I was no longer vexed by doubts as to the direction I should follow, or harassed by darkness or hidden dangers. Through a snow-covered canyon, the way led up toward the summit of low hills. Beyond these, it dipped again into another canon, only to rise a quarter-mile farther on toward a pass which skirted the flank of a rocky hill. I could see by the signs of those who had gone before that, when Dejah Thoris had walked, she had been continually holding back, and that the black man had been compelled to drag her. For other stretches, only his footprints were visible, deep and close together in the heavy snow, and I knew from these signs that then he had been forced to carry her, and I could well imagine that she had fought him fiercely every step of the way. As I came round the jutting promontory of the hill's shoulder, I saw that which quickened my pulses and set my heart to beating high. For within a tiny basin between the crest of this hill and the next stood 4 people before the mouth of a great cave, and beside them upon the gleaming snow rested a flyer which had evidently but just been dragged from its hiding place. The 4 were Dejah Thoris, Fedor, Thurid, and Mad-Eye Shang. The 2 men were engaged in a heated argument, the father of Thurn's threatening, while the black scoffed at him as he went about the work at which he was engaged. As I crept toward them cautiously that I might come as near as possible before being discovered, I saw that finally the men appeared to have reached some sort of a compromise, for with Fedor's assistance, they both set about dragging the resisting Dejah Thoris to the flyer's deck. Here they made her fast, and then both again descended to the ground to complete the preparations for departure. Fedor entered the small cabin upon the vessel's deck. I had come to within a quarter of a mile of them when Mad-Eye Shang espied me. I saw him seize Thurid by the shoulder, wheeling him around in my direction as he pointed to where I was now plainly visible. For the moment that I knew I had been perceived, I cast aside every attempt at stealth and broke into a mad race for the flyer. The 2 redoubled their efforts at the propeller at which they were working, and which very evidently was being replaced after having been removed for some purpose of repair. They had the thing completed before I had covered half the distance that lay between me and them, and then both made a rush for the boarding ladder. Thurid was the first to reach it, and with the agility of a monkey clambered swiftly to the boat's deck, where a touch of the button controlling the buoyancy tanks sent the craft slowly upward, though not with the speed that marks the well-conditioned flyer. I was still some 100 yards away as I saw them rising from my grasp. Back by the city of Cadabra lay a great fleet of mighty flyers, the ships of Helium and Tarth that I had saved from destruction earlier in the day. But before ever I could reach them, Thurid could easily make good his escape. As I ran, I saw Mad-Eye Shang clambering up the swinging ladder toward the deck, while above him leaned the evil face of the firstborn. Trailing rope from the vessel's stern put new hope in me, for if I could but reach it before it whipped too high above my head, there was yet a chance to gain the deck by its slender aid. That there was something radically wrong with the flyer was evident from its lack of buoyancy, and the further fact that though Thurid had turned twice to the starting lever, the boat still hung motionless in the air, except for a slight drifting with a low breeze from the north. Now Mad-Eye Shang was close to the gunwale. A long, claw-like hand was reaching up to grasp the metal rail. Thurid leaned farther down toward his co-conspirator. Suddenly, a raised dagger gleamed in the upflung hand of the black. Down it drove toward the white face of the father of Thurns. With a loud shriek of fear, the holy Hecador grasped frantically at that menacing arm. I was almost to the trailing rope by now. The craft was still rising slowly, the while it drifted from me. Then I stumbled on the icy way, striking my head upon a rock as I fell sprawling, but an arm's length from the rope, the end of which was now just leaving the ground. With the blow upon my head came unconsciousness. It could not have been more than a few seconds that I lay senseless there upon the northern ice, while all that was dearest to me drifted farther from my reach, in the clutches of that black fiend. For when I opened my eyes, Thurid and Mad-Eye Shang yet battled at the ladder's top, and the flyer drifted but 100 yards farther to the south. But the end of the trailing rope was now a good 30 feet above the ground. Goaded to madness by the cruel misfortune that had tripped me when success was almost within my grasp, I tore frantically across the intervening space, and just beneath the rope's dangling end, I put my earthly muscles to the supreme test. With a mighty, cat-like bound, I sprang upward toward that slender strand, the only avenue which yet remained that could carry me to my vanishing love. A foot above its lowest end my fingers closed. Tightly as I clung, I felt the rope slipping through my grasp. I tried to raise my free hand to take a second hold above my first, but the change of position that resulted caused me to slip more rapidly toward the end of the rope. Slowly, I felt the tantalizing thing escaping me. In a moment, all that I had gained would be lost. Then my fingers reached a knot at the very end of the rope and slipped no more. With a prayer of gratitude upon my lips, I scrambled upward toward the boat's deck. I could not see Thurid and Mad-Eye Shang now, but I heard the sounds of conflict, and thus knew that they still fought, the Thurn for his life, and the Black for the increased buoyancy that relief from the weight of even a single body would give the craft. Should Mad-Eye Shang die before I reached the deck, my chances of ever reaching it would be slender indeed, for the Black Dejah need but cut the rope above me to be freed from me forever. For the vessel had drifted across the brink of a chasm into whose yawning depths my body would drop to be crushed to a shapeless pulp should Thurid reach the rope now. At last my hand closed upon the ship's rail, and that very instant a horrid shriek rang out below me that sent my blood cold and turned my horrified eyes downward to a shrieking, hurtling, twisting thing that shot downward into the awful chasm beneath me. It was Mad-Eye Shang, holy Hecador, father of Therns, gone to his last accounting. Then my head came above the deck, and I saw Thurid, dagger in hand, leaping toward me. He was opposite the forward end of the cabin, while I was attempting to clamber aboard near the vessel's stern. But a few paces lay between us. No power on earth could raise me to that deck before the infuriated Black would be upon me. My end had come. I knew it. But had there been a doubt in my mind, the nasty leer of triumph upon that wicked face would have convinced me. Beyond Thurid, I could see my Dejah Thoris, wide-eyed and horrified, struggling at her barns. That she should be forced to witness my awful death made my bitter fate seem doubly cruel. I ceased my efforts to climb across the gunwale. Instead, I took a firm grasp upon the rail with my left hand and drew my dagger. I should at least die as I had lived, fighting. As Thurid came opposite the cabin's doorway, a new element projected itself into the grim tragedy of the air that was being enacted upon the deck of Mad-Eye Shang's disabled flyer. It was Fedor, with flushed face and disheveled hair, and eyes that betrayed the recent presence of mortal tears, above which this proud goddess had always held herself. She leaped to the deck directly before me. In her hand was a long, slim dagger. I cast a last look upon my beloved princess, smiling as men should who are about to die. Then I turned my face up toward Fedor, waiting for the blow. Never have I seen that beautiful face more beautiful than it was at that moment. It seemed incredible that one so lovely could yet harbor within her fair bosom a heart so cruel and relentless. And today there was a new expression in her wondrous eyes that I never before had seen there, an unfamiliar softness and a look of suffering. Thurid was beside her now, pushing past to reach me first, and then what happened so quickly that it was all over before I could realize the truth of it. Fedor's slim hand shot out to close upon the Black's dagger wrist. Her right hand went high with its gleaming blade. "That for Mad-Eye Shang," she cried, and she buried her blade deep in the Dejah's breast. "That for the wrong you would have done Dejah Thoris." And again the sharp steel sank into the bloody flesh. "And that, and that, and that," she shrieked, "for John Carter, Prince of Helium," and with each word her sharp point pierced the vile heart of the great villain. Then, with a vindictive shove, she cast the carcass of the firstborn from the deck to fall in awful silence after the body of his victim. I had been so paralyzed by surprise that I had made no move to reach the deck during the awe-inspiring scene which I had just witnessed, and now I was to be still further amazed by her next act, for Fedor extended her hand to me and assisted me to the deck, where I stood gazing at her in unconcealed and stupefied wonderment. A wan smile touched her lips. It was not the cruel and haughty smile of the goddess with which I was familiar. "You wonder, John Carter," she said, "what strange thing has wrought this change in me? I will tell you. It is love, love of you." And when I darkened my brows in disapproval of her words, she raised an appealing hand. "Wait," she said, "it is a different love from mine. It is the love of your princess, Dejah Thoris, for you that has taught me what true love may be, what it should be, and how far from real love was my selfish and jealous passion for you. Now I am different. Now could I love as Dejah Thoris loves, and so my only happiness can be to know that you and she are once more united, for in her alone can you find true happiness. But I am unhappy because of the wickedness that I have wrought. I have many sins to expiate, and though I be deathless, life is all too short for the atonement. But there is another way, and if Fedor, daughter of the holy Hecador of the holy Therns, has sinned, she has this day already made partial reparation. And lest you doubt the sincerity of her protestations, and her avowal of a new love that embraces Dejah Thoris also, she will prove her sincerity in the only way that lies open. Having saved you for another, Fedor leaves you to her embraces. With her last word she turned and leaped from the vessel's deck into the abyss below. With a cry of horror, I sprang forward in a vain attempt to save the life that for 2 years I would so gladly have seen extinguished. I was too late. With tear-dimmed eyes, I turned away that I might not see the awful sight beneath. A moment later I had struck the bonds from Dejah Thoris, and as her dear arms went about my neck and her perfect lips pressed to mine, I forgot the horrors that I had witnessed and the suffering that I had endured in the rapture of my reward. Chapter 16. The New Ruler, the flyer upon whose deck Dejah Thoris and I found ourselves after 12 long years of separation, proved entirely useless. Her buoyancy tanks leaked badly. Her engine would not start. We were helpless there in mid-air above the Arctic ice. The craft had drifted across the chasm which held the corpses of Mad-Eye Shang, Thurid, and Fedor, and now hung above a low hill. Opening the buoyancy escape valves, I permitted her to come slowly to the ground, and as she touched, Dejah Thoris and I stepped from her deck and, hand in hand, turned back across the frozen waste toward the city of Cadabra. Through the tunnel that had led me in pursuit of them we passed, walking slowly, for we had much to say to each other. She told me of that last terrible moment months before, when the door of her prison cell within the Temple of the Sun was slowly closing between us, of how Fedor had sprung upon her with uplifted dagger, and of Thuvia's shriek as she had realized the foul intention of the Thern goddess. It had been that cry that had rung in my ears all the long, weary months that I had been left in cruel doubt as to my princess' fate. For I had not known that Thuvia had wrested the blade from the daughter of Mad-Eye Shang before it had touched either Dejah Thoris or herself. She told me, too, of the awful eternity of her imprisonment, of the cruel hatred of Fedor and the tender love of Thuvia, and of how even when despair was the darkest, those two red girls had clung to the same hope and belief that John Carter would find a way to release them. Presently we came to the chamber of Sarlan. I had been proceeding without thought of caution, for I was sure that the city and the palace were both in the hands of my friends by this time. And so it was that I bolted into the chamber, full into the midst of a dozen nobles of the court of Salensus Arl. They were passing through on their way to the outside world along the corridors we had just traversed. At sight of us, they halted in their tracks, and then an ugly smile overspread the features of their leader. "The author of all our misfortunes," he cried, pointing at me. "We shall have the satisfaction of a partial vengeance at least when we leave behind us here the dead and mutilated corpses of the prince and princess of Helium. When they find them," he went on, jerking his thumb upward toward the palace above, "they will realize that the vengeance of the Yellow Man cost his enemies dear. Prepare to die, John Carter, but that your end may be the more bitter, know that I may change my intention as to meeting a merciful death to your princess. Possibly she shall be preserved as a plaything for my nobles." I stood close to the instrument-covered wall, Dejah Thoris at my side. She looked up at me wonderingly as the warriors advanced upon us with drawn swords. for mine still hung within its scabbard at my side, and there was a smile upon my lips. The yellow nobles, too, looked in surprise, and then as I made no move to draw they hesitated, fearing a ruse, but their leader urged them on. When they had come almost within sword's reach of me, I raised my hand and laid it upon the polished surface of a great lever, and then, still smiling grimly, I looked my enemies full in the face, as when they came to a sudden stop, casting affrighted glances at me and at one another. "Stop!" shrieked their leader. "You dream not what you do." "Right you are," I replied. "John Carter does not dream. He knows that should one of you take another step toward Dejah Thoris, Princess of Helium, I pull this lever wide, and she and I shall die together, but we shall not die alone." The nobles shrank back, whispering together for a few moments. At last, their leader turned to me. "Go your way, John Carter," he said, "and we shall go ours." "Prisoners do not go their own way," I answered, "and you are prisoners, prisoners of the Prince of Helium." Before they could make answer, a door upon the opposite side of the apartment opened, and a score of yellow men poured into the apartment. For an instant the nobles looked relieved, and then as their eyes fell upon the leader of the new party, their faces fell, for he was Tarlu, rebel Prince of Marantina, and they knew that they could look for neither aid nor mercy at his hands. Tarlu took in the situation at a glance, smiling. "Well done, John Carter," he cried. "You turn their own mighty power against them. Fortunate for Arkar is it that you were here to prevent their escape, for these be the greatest villains north of the ice barrier, and this one," pointing to the leader of the party, "would have made himself Jeddak of Jeddaks in the place of the dead Salensus all. Then indeed would we have had a more villainous ruler than the hated tyrant who fell before your sword." The Arkarian nobles now submitted to arrest, since nothing but death faced them should they resist, and escorted by the warriors of Tarlu, we made our way to the great audience chamber that had been Salensus Arl's. Here was a vast concourse of warriors, red men from Helium and Tarth, yellow men of the north, rubbing elbows with the blacks of the firstborn who had come under my friend Zadar to help in the search for me and my princess. There were savage, green warriors from the Dead Sea bottoms of the south, and a handful of white-skinned Therns who had renounced their religion and sworn allegiance to Zadar. There was Tardo's Moors and Moors Kajak, and tall and mighty in his gorgeous warrior trappings, Carthoris, my son. These three fell upon Dejah Thoris as we entered the apartment, and though the lives and training of royal Martians tend not toward vulgar demonstration, I thought that they would suffocate her with their embraces. And there were Tars Tarkas, Jeddak of Thark, and Kantos Kan, my old-time friends, and leaping and tearing at my harness in the exuberance of his great love was dear old Wulla, frantic mad with happiness. Long and loud was the cheering that burst forth at sight of us. Deafening was the din of ringing metal as the veteran warriors of every Martian clime clashed their blades together on high in token of success and victory. But as I passed among the throng of saluting nobles and warriors, Jeds and Jeddaks, my heart still was heavy, for there were two faces missing that I would have given much to have seen there. Thuvan Dihin and Thuvir of Tarth were not to be found in the great chamber. I made inquiries concerning them among men of every nation, and at last from one of the yellow prisoners of war I learned that they had been apprehended by an officer of the palace as they sought to reach the pit of plenty while I lay imprisoned there. I did not need to ask to know what had sent them thither. The courageous Jeddak and his loyal daughter. My informer said that they lay now in one of the many buried dungeons of the palace, where they had been placed pending a decision as to their fate by the tyrant of the north. A moment later searching parties were scouring the ancient pile in search of them, and my cup of happiness was full when I saw them being escorted into the room by a cheering guard of honor. Thuvia's first act was to rush to the side of Dejah Thoris, and I needed no better proof of the love these two bore for each other than the sincerity with which they embraced. Looking down upon that crowded chamber stood the silent and empty throne of Arkar. Of all the strange scenes it must have witnessed since that long-dead age that had first seen a Jeddak of Jeddaks take his seat upon it, none might compare with that upon which it now looked down. And as I pondered the past and future of that long-buried race of black-bearded yellow men, I thought that I saw a brighter and more useful existence for them among the great family of friendly nations that now stretched from the South Pole almost to their very doors. 22 years before I had been cast, naked and a stranger, into this strange and savage world. The hand of every race and nation was raised in continual strife and warring against the men of every other land and color. Today, by the might of my sword and the loyalty of the friends my sword had made for me, black man and white, red man and green rubbed shoulders in peace and good fellowship. All the nations of Barsoom were not yet as one, but a great stride forward toward that goal had been taken. And now if I could but cement the fierce yellow race into this solidarity of nations, I should feel that I had rounded out a great life work, and repaid to Mars at least a portion of the immense debt of gratitude I owed her for having given me my Dejah Thoris. And as I thought, I saw but one way, and a single man who could ensure the success of my hopes. As is ever the way with me, I acted then as I always act, without deliberation and without consultation. Those who do not like my plans and my ways of promoting them have always their swords at their sides wherewith to back up their disapproval. But now there seemed to be no dissenting voice, as, grasping Talu by the arm, I sprang to the throne that had once been Silence's Arl's. "Warriors of Barsoom," I cried, "Cadabra has fallen, and with her the hateful tyrant of the north. But the integrity of Arkar must be preserved. The red men are ruled by red Jedaks. The green warriors of the ancient seas acknowledge none but a green ruler. The firstborn of the South Pole take their law from Black Zardar. Nor would it be to the interests of either yellow or red man were a red Jedak to sit upon the throne of Arkar. There be but one warrior best fitted for the ancient and mighty title of Jedak of Jedaks of the North. Men of Arkar, raise your swords to your new ruler, Talu, the rebel prince of Marantina." And then a great cry of rejoicing rose among the free men of Marantina and the Cadabran prisoners, for all had thought that the red men would retain that which they had taken by force of arms, for such had been the way upon Barsoom, and that they should be ruled henceforth by an alien Jedak. The victorious warriors who had followed Thoris joined in the mad demonstration, and amidst the wild confusion and the tumult and the cheering, Dejah Thoris and I passed out into the gorgeous garden of the Jedaks that graces the inner courtyard of the palace of Cadabra. At our heels walked Wooler, and upon a carved seat of wondrous beauty, beneath a bower of purple blooms, we saw two who had preceded us, Thuvir of Tarth and Thoris of Helium. The handsome head of the handsome youth was bent low above the beautiful face of his companion. I looked at Dejah Thoris, smiling, and as I drew her close to me, I whispered, "Why not? Indeed, why not? What matter ages in this world of perpetual youth?" Asterisk, 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 we remained at Cadabra, the guests of Talu, until after his formal induction into office, and then, upon the great fleet which I had been so fortunate to preserve from destruction, we sailed south across the ice barrier, but not before we had witnessed the total demolition of the grim guardian of the north under orders of the new Jedak of Jedaks. "Henceforth," he said, as the work was completed, "the fleets of the red men and the black are free to come and go across the ice barrier as over their own lands. The carrion caves shall be cleansed, that the green men may find an easy way to the land of the yellow, and the hunting of the sacred apt shall be the sport of my nobles, until no single specimen of that hideous creature roams the frozen north." We bade our yellow friends farewell with real regret as we set sail for Tarth. There we remained, the guest of Thuvan, for a month, and I could see that Thoris would have remained forever had he not been a prince of Helium. Above the mighty forests of Kaal we hovered until word from Cullen Tithe brought us to his single landing tower, where all day and half a night the vessels disembarked their crews. At the city of Kaal we visited, cementing the new ties that had been formed between Kaal and Helium, and then one long-to-be-remembered day we sighted the tall, thin towers of the twin cities of Helium. The people had long been preparing for our coming. The sky was gorgeous with gaily trimmed flyers. Every roof within both cities was spread with costly silks and tapestries. Gold and jewels were scattered over roof and street and plaza, so that the two cities seemed ablaze with the fires of the hearts of the magnificent stones and burnished metal that reflected the brilliant sunlight, changing it into countless glorious hues. At last, after 12 years, the royal family of Helium was reunited in their own mighty city, surrounded by joy-mad millions before the palace gates. Women and children and mighty warriors wept in gratitude for the fate that had restored their beloved Tardos Moors and the divine princess whom the whole nation idolized. Nor did any of us who had been upon that expedition of indescribable danger and glory lack for plaudits. That night, a messenger came to me as I sat with Dejah Thoris and Thoris upon the roof of my city palace, where we had long since caused a lovely garden to be made that we three might find seclusion and quiet happiness among ourselves, far from the pomp and ceremony of court, to summon us to the temple of reward, where one is to be judged this night. The summons concluded. I racked my brain to try and determine what important case there might be pending which could call the royal family from their palaces on the eve of their return to Helium after years of absence. But when the Jeddak summons, no man delays. As our flyer touched the landing stage at the temple's top, we saw countless other craft arriving and departing. In the streets below, a great multitude surged toward the great gates of the temple. Slowly there came to me the recollection of the deferred doom that awaited me since that time I had been tried here in the temple by Zataraz for the sin of returning from the valley door and the lost sea of Chorus. Could it be possible that the strict sense of justice which dominates the men of Mars had caused them to overlook the great good that had come out of my heresy? Could they ignore the fact that to me, and me alone, was due the rescue of Thoris, of Dejah Thoris, of Moors Kajak, of Tardos Moors? I could not believe it, and yet for what other purpose could I have been summoned to the temple of reward immediately upon the return of Tardos Moors to his throne? My first surprise as I entered the temple and approached the throne of righteousness was to note the men who sat there as judges. There was Killen Tithe, Jeddak of Kaal, whom we had but just left within his own palace a few days since. There was Thuvan Din, Jeddak of Tarth. How came he to Helium as soon as we? There was Tars Tarkas, Jeddak of Thark, and Zardar, Jeddak of the Firstborn. There was Tarlu, Jeddak of Jeddaks of the North, whom I could have sworn was still in his icebound Hearthouse city beyond the northern barrier, and among them sat Tardos Moors and Moors Kajak, with enough lesser Jeds and Jeddaks to make up the 31 who must sit in judgment upon their fellow man. A right royal tribunal indeed, and such a one, I warrant, as never before sat together during all the history of ancient Mars. As I entered, silence fell upon the great concourse of people that packed the auditorium. Then Tardos Moors arose. "John Carter," he said in his deep, martial voice, "take your place upon the pedestal of truth, for you are to be tried by a fair and impartial tribunal of your fellow men." With level eye and high-held head, I did as he bade, and as I glanced about that circle of faces that a moment before I could have sworn contained the best friends I had upon Barsoom, I saw no single friendly glance, only stern, uncompromising judges, there to do their duty. A clerk rose, and from a great book read a long list of the more notable deeds that I had thought to my credit, covering a long period of 22 years, since first I had stepped the Arsha sea bottom beside the incubator of the Tharks. With the others, he read of all that I had done within the circle of the Arts Mountains, where the holy Therns and the Firstborn had held sway. It is the way upon Barsoom to recite a man's virtues with his sins when he is come to trial, and so I was not surprised that all that was to my credit should be read there to my judges, who knew it all by heart, even down to the present moment. When the reading had ceased, Tardos Moors arose. "Most righteous judges," he exclaimed, "you have heard recited all that is known of John Carter, Prince of Helium, the good with the bad. What is your judgment?" Then Tars Tarkas came slowly to his feet, unfolding all his mighty, towering height until he loomed, a green bronze statue, far above us all. He turned a baleful eye upon me. He, Tars Tarkas, with whom I had fought through countless battles, whom I loved as a brother. I could have wept had I not been so mad with rage that I almost whipped my sword out and had at them all upon the spot. "Judges," he said, "there can be but one verdict. No longer may John Carter be Prince of Helium," he paused, "but instead let him be Jeddak of Jeddaks, Warlord of Barsoom." As the 31 judges sprang to their feet with drawn and upraised swords in unanimous concurrence in the verdict, the storm broke throughout the length and breadth and height of that mighty building, until I thought the roof would fall from the thunder of the mad shouting. Now, at last, I saw the grim humor of the method they had adopted to do me this great honor. But that there was any hoax in the reality of the title they had conferred upon me was readily disproved by the sincerity of the congratulations that were heaped upon me by the judges first, and then the nobles. Presently 50 of the mightiest nobles of the greatest courts of Mars marched down the broad aisle of hope, bearing a splendid car upon their shoulders. And as the people saw who sat within, the cheers that had rung out for me paled into insignificance beside those which thundered through the vast edifice now. For she whom the nobles carried was Dejah Thoris, beloved princess of Helium. Straight to the throne of righteousness they bore her, and their Tardos Moors assisted her from the car, leading her forward to my side. "Let a world's most beautiful woman share the honor of her husband," he said. Before them all I drew my wife close to me and kissed her upon the lips.